Hello, welcome back to my fave fanfics. Here, I post, well, my favorite fanfictions, if that wasn't obvious. I do hope you'll enjoy them as much as I do. Please like and subscribe for more content. Without further ado, let's get started.
This is the fourth part of What If Albedo Ended Up in the World of Full Metal Alchemist. Credit goes to Otaku553. Chapter 7. By the time Edward woke up, his entire body still hurt like a bitch. It actually felt like it hurt even more like a bitch than before, when he'd either been high on adrenaline or just straight up unconscious, with no in-between. Then again, Edward was probably high on painkillers right now as well, so maybe he didn't have a good frame of reference. His groggy attempt to sit up failed miserably. The moment he tried, the pain went instantly from a dull, constant but bearable pressure to thousands of scalding needle-sharp stings piercing into his side. Shit. He hissed, grit his teeth and held his breath, waiting for the sudden excruciating pang to recede once more into a more manageable throbbing. The telltale whispers of rattling armor nearby rang in his ears. "Brother. You're awake." Quote. Ed flopped back onto the pillow and took a gulp of the sterile-smelling hospital air. The refreshing coolness of oxygen against his throat did little to relieve his pain. "Please don't try to get up. You'll reopen your wounds," Al fretted. "Hey, Al," Ed tried to smile. His voice came out much feebler than he expected, but it was fine. He just needed to warm up his vocal cords a little. Al sighed, a mixture of relief and concern and resignation. "How are you feeling?" Quote. "Like shit," Ed answered with no hesitation. Al chuckled softly, the vibration and collision of armor pieces against each other echoing a quiet song of clanking metal through the room. "Well, I'm glad you're safe. We probably shouldn't do anything that reckless for a while, huh?" Quote. Ed nodded weakly. "Damn it." Al sat back down in the comically small chair beside his bed. Ed took the chance to look out the curtains. It was still dark. "What time is it?" Quote. "Almost 5 a.m., Al answered. "I'm surprised you woke up so soon." Ed beamed with one of his trademark hearty grins. "You know me. Nothing can get me down for long. I'll be up and running again before you know it, so don't worry, Al." He'd imagined himself saying it enthusiastically, energetically, but Ed hadn't been lying when he said he felt like shit. His voice still sounded like a low croak, the vibrations irritating his parched throat. So, of course, his words had the absolute opposite effect from what he intended, and Al just looked even more worried. "You should go back to sleep, brother," Al spoke softly. "You need it to heal. Maybe you'll also grow taller then." The jab was quiet, lacking most of its usual teasing energy. It still managed to elicit a weak chuckle, more like a huff of air than a laugh, from Ed. "Maybe," he rasped. But he conceded. The best way to ignore pain was to sleep through it, so Ed closed his eyes and tried to lapse back into the lulling calm of sleep. It didn't work. He felt an itch under his bandages and the pain seemed to pulse stronger and pull him back from the brink of sleep every time Ed felt the clutches of unconsciousness on his mind. It wasn't like he could toss and turn until he was comfortable either. Just trying to sit up slightly had left him drained and motionless. He wanted to blame any other reason for why he couldn't fall back asleep. Any reason other than the image of a white coat, bright teal eyes, and four-pointed golden star tattoo that refused to leave his mind no matter how many times he'd mentally swatted it away. It felt like hours had passed over the span of mere minutes, Ed trying his best to ignore the sound of his heartbeat in his ears. "Can't fall asleep," he mumbled, "stupid injuries." "Try your best," Al said in a tone somewhere between genuine and snarky. It brought a smile to Ed's face. They sat in silence for a bit. Naturally, Ed's overactive mind wandered. The laboratory. The people with the Ouroboros tattoo. Albedo's teal eyes and white coat flitted through Ed's mind again. "Hey Al?" Quote. Quote. Ed hesitated. "What do you think of Albedo?" Quote. Al hummed in consideration. "What about him?" Quote. "I don't know. Just in general." Well, Al held a finger to his metaphorical chin. "He's definitely very mysterious, I guess. And never talks much about himself. But he's nice." "Mysterious," Ed repeated under his breath. "We basically don't know anything about him. We don't know where he's from or why he got his state certification or anything. There's just nothing about him adds up." "True," Al chimed. "I mean, there was that time when he wasn't breathing after encountering Scar, but he woke up just fine. Right?" Al's vindication for his suspicions made Ed feel much more justified. "And there's his weird alchemy that doesn't use any circle or clapping. The light from his transmutations isn't even blue sometimes." He cut himself off with a cough, the motion jostling the wounds on his torso and shoulder, sending renewed spikes of pain through his body. "Ow. Maybe you should slow down," Al suggested. "Do you need a cup of water?" Quote. Ed's face scrunched up in an expression of exaggerated displeasure. "I'll be fine. Anyways," he continued, "the way he just makes his sword disappear. Did you hear what the workers at the first library said? He just made a bunch of books appear out of nowhere. A complete and utter contradiction of equivalent exchange," he huffed. Al nodded. "You're right. There's a lot we don't know about him." He paused. "But," Al looked straight into Ed's eyes, "I still think he's a good person." Ed averted his own. Al was kind. Al was also usually a better judge of character than Ed. "I know," he settled on saying. "It's just confusing." Al hummed. They sat in silence for a bit longer. "Did something happen in the laboratory? With Albedo, I mean." Ed used a hand to pinch at the creases in his brow as if it would relax them somewhat. "Yeah. It was kind of fucked up, not gonna lie." Al waited patiently for Ed to collect his thoughts. "So, after I beat the Slicers, a pair of serial killers who had their souls bonded to a single set of armor, there were these two people who had Ouroboros tattoos," Ed began. "The symbol of infinite longevity," Al noted. "Right. And I don't think they were human. One of them was able to extend her fingers like claws or something to meters long and break through a steel helmet with them." What?" Al stammered. Ed chuckled, eking out any bit of humor he could find in this conversation. He winced when the gash in his side protested again. "Yeah. I had about the same reaction. It was weird. Like something out of a storybook." His smile fell. Even weirder was, they asked Albedo to join them, offered him a philosopher's stone and everything. Al gasped. He turned them down, Ed quickly clarified. He talked with them about some kind of nonsense of having a philosopher's stone in them or something, but that meant he had to be related to them in some way then, Al whispered. "And we know that Albedo's capable of some pretty impossible things, so it's not too far-fetched, either." "Yeah." They stewed in the silence with their thoughts swirling aimlessly around them. "I just have no idea what to think anymore," Ed muttered under his breath. Was Albedo a friend? An enemy? Was he human? Did he lie about not having a philosopher's stone, and if not, how was he doing alchemy? Why did those people try to recruit him? Albedo had always been wrapped in 9 layers of eccentricity and mystery, and Ed had previously been content leaving it be. But the thought of Albedo possibly joining the people who had killed so easily and so nearly cost Ed some even graver injuries felt like betrayal. By all means, Ed felt like he had a right to hate the guy for hiding so much. An alchemist's curiosity was not easily quelled, and Ed's questions now felt less like weights on his mind and more like burning pyres that would not extinguish until he had answers for them. Without knowing what Albedo truly was, Ed was extremely uneasy. He didn't know if he should tiptoe on eggshells and try to avoid talking about it like he had been before, or just march up to Albedo and demand answers. And honestly, he was leaning towards the latter at this point. "I still think he's a good person, though," Al interrupted his thoughts. "He's a bit cold sometimes, but I think it's just how he grew up." He said his teacher wanted perfection from him. He's helped us a lot, and he really does treat Nina like a younger sister. Ed had to concede to that point. He agreed. Albedo had proven time and time again to be both a kind caretaker to Nina and a formidable ally to Ed and Al in both intellect and strength. Except that was before the people that had murdered 2 men right in front of Ed had asked Albedo to join them. That was before Albedo had shaken off his grip with an icy glare. "I do not belong on your side either," he'd said. He belonged neither on the side of those people, nor on the side of Ed and Al, whatever sides he had meant. Did he not see himself as their ally? Did he think he didn't belong on Ed's and Al's side after everything was said and done? Ed sighed and closed his eyes, relegating all thoughts of Albedo to a think-about-later category. If he kept racking his brain like this, he wouldn't be able to get any sleep at all. His throat itched, and a layer of sweat had formed thanks to the layers of thick blankets piled on him. Damn it. Albedo hadn't wanted to wake Nina and the Hughes family up by returning to their home well past midnight, so Brosh had ended up calling a car for him to lodge temporarily at the barracks. Brosh had also notified Hughes of Albedo's whereabouts, apparently, which was how the tired alchemist found himself opening the door of his room in the morning to find the man and Nina right outside. Despite having just seen her several hours ago the night before, it felt to Albedo like a considerable amount of time had passed since the last time he'd seen her. Perhaps the events of last night had altered his perception of time? Or perhaps it was because he'd spent entire days with the brothers at the library, only catching a few glances of Nina per day. Nina puffed her cheeks in a childish display of anger as Albedo leaned down to pat her braided hair. "I'm sorry for leaving you for so long, Nina," Albedo smiled. "Forgive me?" Quote. "Fine," Nina huffed. Albedo stood back up. With his short stature, he needed to tilt his head up a bit to look at Hughes. "Don't be a stranger, Albedo." Hughes crossed his arms and leaned on the doorframe. "You should have come home last night. Why didn't you?" Quote. Albedo looked away. He couldn't quite meet Hughes's eyes, which were filled with concern. "I was worried I'd bother your family. It was quite late. I apologize." "None of that," Hughes waved off his words nonchalantly. "Don't apologize for your consideration. Just know that you're welcome whenever, all right? Even at ungodly hours of the night." Albedo nodded. The warmth in his chest swelled. Albedo thought he was getting more used to riding in an automobile by now. It was an odd sensation, being moved at a relatively consistent speed higher than any wagon was capable of. It was smoother and faster than horse-drawn wagons, but bumpier still than Mondstadt's cargo-carrying air balloons. The scenery of bustling store fronts and towering apartments passed too quickly for any clear image to cement itself in Albedo's mind. He'd have to try walking around and sketching it at some point. Hughes's chatter easily drowned out the subtle din of the car's machinery. "So, did you have any plans for today? Or do you just want to come with me and Nina to visit Ed?" he asked. Albedo answered honestly. "I didn't have any plans." "Great. Coming with us then," Hughes interrupted happily before Albedo could elaborate. Albedo opened his mouth, and then shut it. He didn't have any immediate plans, but he wasn't certain Edward would be very receptive to his appearance, so he'd wanted at least to make himself scarce for the day, or until Edward approached him. Hughes had gone off on a tangent about plans for Alicia's upcoming birthday party though, so Albedo couldn't very well interrupt to correct him. Shortly, they reached a large building proudly draped with large emerald Amestrian flags. The stone brick walls reminded Albedo of the Knights of Favonius headquarters, though the size was a different question. This building easily exceeded any building in Mondstadt. Albedo would speculate that it was closer to the size of Mondstadt's cathedral than the Knights' headquarters Albedo was more used to. "I just need to give Sheska a word or two, and then we can head over to the hospital," Hughes explained. This was where Hughes worked then, Albedo noted. "Sheska is working here now?" Quote. Hughes blinked. "Weren't you there when the brothers got me to hire her?" Quote. Albedo averted his eyes. "I was busy, not untrue. Whenever Albedo was absorbed in a task, he gave his full attention to it. In any case, I'd like to request a favor from her, if she isn't too busy. Albedo's browse through the third library he and the brothers had holed up in for the past few days had truly proven that the best source of knowledge in the nation was the first library, which was nothing but a pile of ashes now. Unfortunately, he had not had the foresight to search for and save books relating to Nina's circumstances when the building had collapsed. He could take a few days to explore the second library for information, but Cheska would likely be his best chance of finding any primary research documents concerning chimera bioalchemy. When Hughes alighted from the car, Albedo opened the door on his side and stepped out as well. Nina followed. "Welcome to Central Command Branch Office 3. Hughes announced with more grandeur than the building was due. "It'll be a short-lived visit though. Next stop, Central Hospital." Under his breath, he added, "Cheska will need to work some overtime." Albedo exhaled. "Do try not to shirk too much of your duties onto her." "Ah!" Hughes mock cried. "I've been betrayed. Scolded by my own ass." He suddenly paused, stopping himself. Albedo wondered what Hughes meant to say. Hughes picked up the nonchalant atmosphere back up effortlessly, swerving back to Nina. "Nina. Back me up." Quote. Nina's chiming laughter echoed through the sunlit hallway like bells. It was an idyllic scene. Albedo wished he had the time to pause and sketch it. Maze stood back as Albedo relayed a request to Cheska for any documents she had on medical alchemy and chimera transmutation. That had been a close call. He wasn't sure Albedo would take it well being called his son. Surely he had his own family and circumstances regarding them. It had just felt all too perfect at the time, but even Maze did not know if he could treat Albedo as a son. Alicia was his first experience in parenthood. Alicia engulfed almost the entirety of his mind when Gracia didn't, and it reminded Maze. This was what it felt like to love. It was a joy in every moment, even the toughest. It was unsolicited pride, unequivocal care, unconditional affection. He didn't know if he could give Albedo and Nina that. He didn't know if either of them even wanted it. But he could tell he was feeling it, in the slight nudge of concern in his heart when Albedo leaned unmovingly over books for hours on end, in the warmth in his chest as he watched Nina prance around with braids in her hair. It was there, and it was growing. It had only been slightly longer than a week that Albedo had stayed with the Hughes family for, and he and Nina made such natural fixtures that Albedo's absence to work with the Elrics had been more abnormal than not. Something had irrevocably shifted in the family's dynamic. Gracia had made an extra cup of tea in the evening for a busy alchemist who wasn't there. Alicia had pouted and whined while Nina had reassured her that brother Albedo would come home soon for sure. Hughes recognized that Albedo was mysterious. He didn't know where Albedo was from, why he was an alchemist, or what his goals were, and yet Albedo's quiet courtesy and consideration had easily carved their own place within the household. Albedo's eyes were cold bright teal, but his sparse and slight smiles gave the home more light and warmth than any lantern or lamp could. As long as Albedo wanted it, Maze knew that the whole Hughes family would gladly welcome him and Nina. When they arrived at the hospital, Albedo was prepared to make an excuse so he could avoid Edward's room. Unfortunately for Albedo, Nina looked up at him with her large eyes, delaying him just enough so that Hughes could grab onto Albedo's arm and drag him to Edward's room anyways. Plan failed. Hughes's grip was not particularly tight, but Albedo found himself being pulled towards Edward's room regardless. "Yo, Ed." Quote. Hughes's characteristically boisterous greeting brought a great deal of energy to the room. Ed chuckled from where he sat in the bed. Then, he caught sight of bright teal eyes, and froze. Albedo looked exactly how Ed was used to seeing him, not a hair out of place, stony mask of courteous and neutral stoicism firmly in place. There was none of the biting coldness Ed saw in his eyes last night, and he didn't know whether he should have been reassured or disconcerted by that. "Edward," Albedo greeted quietly. "I'm glad to see you doing well. I hope your recovery goes smoothly." There was a tension stretched taut throughout the room like a web of unsaid words. Ed didn't know what to say back, or if he should say anything at all. Albedo was still, seeming almost like a statue. The longer Ed looked, the more it was unnatural. Albedo's shoulders didn't bob up and down with his breathing. Albedo's hands didn't sway at his sides from gravity. Ed could swear that Albedo wasn't even blinking. "I will excuse myself," Albedo finally said, before leaving the doorway. Despite Albedo's apparent indifference, his departure was all too clearly an awkward and hasty retreat. Hughes blinked, head swiveling between the two young state alchemists. "Did I miss something?" Quote. Even his confusion did not give much levity to the room's heavy atmosphere. "Brother, you were glaring," Al scolded. Ed let his unconsciously furrowed eyebrows relax, finding that they were drawn tighter than he had realized. "Oh." Al sighed. "I'm going to go talk to him." The clanking steps of heavy armor quieted as Al left the room. Al thought it was awfully rude of Ed to be so openly hostile towards Albedo when the enigmatic alchemist hadn't done anything to put his character into question so far. Perhaps Albedo was a bit unnatural, but Alphonse was a walking and talking empty suit of armor, and Ed was the youngest state alchemist while missing half his limbs. Unnatural was sort of difficult to define to the Elrics. Simply put, he hoped to apologize to Albedo on Ed's behalf, and check afterwards how Albedo was doing. He couldn't tell if Albedo had been injured last night or not, but he'd caught a glimpse of Albedo leaving the hospital under Brosh's escort last night, so at least Albedo wasn't seriously injured like Ed was. Still, Albedo last night had seemed shaken somehow. Silent, withdrawn, unresponsive. Nothing like the almost flawlessly neutral and graceful confidence he usually held himself with. He'd seemed fine just now, when poking his head into Ed's room, but even so, Al could hear the way his voice was deliberately steady and quiet. Al just wanted a verbal confirmation from Albedo himself, that he was okay. "Albedo?" Al finally saw the familiar white coat on a waiting bench next to the restrooms. "There you are." "Oh." "Alphonse," Albedo greeted. "Hello." Al took a seat next to Albedo, easily occupying most of the bench. Albedo had a sketchbook open in his lap, and a pencil in his hand hovered over a picturesque sketch of a hooded statue underneath a large tree, surrounded by sprawling plains of wind-tousled grass and bright skies of soft clouds. Al took a moment to marvel at the beautiful piece before starting. "Sorry for brother's rudeness earlier." Albedo had a peaceful expression on his face, not bothering to look up as his pencil flitted across the page. "There's no need to apologize," he hummed. Based on Edward's temperament last night, his reaction today was expected. "I see," Al paused, not sure if he should push Albedo to accept the apology. Too long of a silence had passed for him to bring it up again, so Al moved on. "Anyways, I also wanted to ask if you were alright after last night." Albedo nodded politely. "Thank you. I am fine," he replied, with no elaboration. "And you?" Quote. "Huh?" Quote. "Are you alright after last night?" Albedo returned his question to him. "Oh." Al simply sat for a moment, caught off guard by the hint of concern in Albedo's usually neutral voice. "I'm fine too," Al chuckled weakly. Suit of armor and all that. The armor wasn't something Al usually drew attention to. Ed and everyone else, Winry, Granny Pinaco, Colonel Mustang even, always tried so hard to make Al feel human in any way they could. Al truthfully hated the armor with a passion, but voicing it did no good. Al usually focused instead on what he hoped to do when he was no longer armor. Then again, could he leave the armor if he were an armor puppet? Albedo made a short sound of either thoughtfulness or absent-mindedness. Al couldn't quite tell which, and flipped a page of his sketchbook. "I see." The two sat in companionable silence, Al's armored form probably looking comically large next to Albedo's slight stature. Al wasn't sure whether to be grateful or not that Albedo hadn't commented on his uneasiness. Perhaps the former. He didn't want to burden Albedo with his own existential crises. Existential crises. He was a walking and talking suit of armor. Was he human at all? Or was he created by Ed like Barry the Chopper had tried to convince him? No, Al was certain his memories were genuine. Otherwise, Ed would not have felt so guilty about turning Al into a suit of armor. Otherwise, Ed would not have become a dog of the military for both of their sakes. Otherwise, Winry and Granny Pinocchio would not have spent so much effort supporting both of them on their journey. Al should have known better than to listen to a serial killer, but every uncertainty seemed to wedge itself into his mind, refusing to leave. Did Ed really care? Had he become a state alchemist for them or for himself? Were Winry and Granny supporting both of them or just Ed? No. No, Al was being foolish. Ed had blamed himself so much for harming both of them with the taboo, and Al was not going to invalidate Ed's emotions by believing a serial killer he had just met over his own brother. Al knew he was a genius. Ed had always maintained one step ahead of Al, mostly due to being a year older than him, but Al was more than well aware that he himself was never far behind. Al could rationalize that at 11 years old, Ed would have had neither the knowledge, material, nor capability to synthesize an armor puppet. To begin with, making armor puppets from scratch most likely wasn't possible. Movement and sentience required a soul, and to create a soul was unheard of. Most alchemists, as purely scientific thinkers, hardly even believed in the existence of a soul. A soul bound to armor would remember being human. Since Al had previously been the only armor-bound soul he and brother had known of, they hadn't had anything to compare against. But now, with the armor-bound souls he and Ed had fought last night, this hypothesis had been proven consistent across 4 examples. How realistic would it be for Ed to fabricate 10 years of brotherhood and 8 years of memories, excluding 2 from infantile amnesia? Unrealistic. Outside the realm of possibility, even. Al felt like groaning for even considering it. Still, the thought wouldn't go away. Like a weed, even after picking it, it grew back tenfold, until it was the only thing on Al's mind. The other thought that appeared was more of a traitorous suggestion, especially after Ed had voiced his suspicions that morning. Maybe ask Albedo, his mind supplied. He's a trustworthy alchemist with even more knowledge than Ed. He said it before he could back out and stop himself. So, this will sound kind of out of the blue, he blurted, but how hard would it be to make a soul? Out of alchemy, I mean. He did not miss the way Albedo completely froze, somehow momentarily becoming even more statue-like than he already was. Why do you ask? Quote. Al scratched at his helmet, the metal grooves so unlike the soft blonde hair he thought he remembered having. No reason, he lied. Humor me? Quote. Albedo appraised him with bright eyes that made Al want to fidget. I see. He looked away, and Al resisted the urge to sigh in relief as those intense teal eyes stopped boring into him. Creating a soul is not impossible. It is much easier to do with simple life forms such as insects and small animals. Creating a sentient soul, with human cognition and intelligence, however, requires a great deal of effort and material. Al sat, slack-jawed. Not that he had a jaw to slack, but he was amply flabbergasted. It's possible to? Quote. Theoretically, Albedo nodded, still not looking Al in the eyes. But Al could hear the certainty in Albedo's voice. Albedo was far more familiar with the topic of souls than anybody following the laws of alchemy should be. Human transmutation is forbidden. It is not impossible, Albedo added, but it is extremely difficult, and likely could not be done in a single lifetime. Though Albedo's answers had not been what Al expected, his worry dissipated. He could probably write off what Barry had told him as a ploy to cause him unrest. It would be impossible for him to be an armor puppet Ed created after all. Of course, Albedo said. Why would you think so? Quote. Oh, Al sheepishly twiddled his thumbs. He hadn't realized he'd spoken aloud. The person I fought outside the laboratory last night said so. I shouldn't have listened. Albedo put a hand on his chin. If it's any reassurance, Albedo hesitated. As if words of comfort were more difficult to say than the most complex alchemical theorems he usually recited with ease. Al patiently waited for Albedo to gather his thoughts and finally speak. Created armor puppet or not, your existence and sentience are real. Additionally, it is nearly impossible to overwrite the information a soul holds. If you hold memories of your time in a human body, then it is very unlikely that they were fabricated. It wasn't exactly what Al needed to hear. But in an odd and very distinctly Albedo way, it did end up being reassuring. Thanks, Albedo. Al tried to smile. If Albedo noticed the way Al's voice faltered, he didn't mention it. His eyes returned to his sketch. Ed's suspicions from that morning rang in Al's mind. Ed and Al knew more than they should have about human transmutation, but only about the aspects relating to the creation of a physical body and the binding of a pre-existing soul to said body. Albedo was speaking of creating a new soul altogether. As he returned to Ed's room, Al's mind ran wild. This sort of alchemy could not be studied freely. Albedo would need the means and resources to experiment, which only the Amestrian government could provide, unless Albedo was a foreigner. But even Drachma, the largest country bordering Amestris, couldn't match up to Amestris's developments in alchemy. But, if Albedo had researched how to create souls with the help of the Amestrian government, then surely he should have known about the secret of Philosopher's Stone. Yet Albedo had seemed just as surprised by the stone as Al and Ed. Not to mention, Albedo had just joined the State Alchemists a mere month ago. Or had that been a ruse? But even though he had never been able to tell what Albedo was thinking in his silent demeanor, Al didn't think Albedo would lie. No one who dedicated their life to a pursuit of fundamental truths of the universe could maintain a lie for long, Al thought. Albedo was puzzling. Gracia leaned over the blonde alchemist, who was absorbed in his sketch. That's beautiful, she breathed. Over elegant railings peeked a fountain of stone surrounded by charmingly small wooden shopfronts. To the right, a cozy restaurant with an open stove. To the left, a tent over shelves and stacks of tomes near a sort of elaborately designed table Gracia had never seen before. Albedo nodded, not looking up from where his pencil etched in the figures of two people near the table. Marveling at the art, Gracia nearly forgot her original purpose for bothering Albedo. Sorry for interrupting. Could you help me decorate for Alicia's party tonight? I can't reach the top of the cabinet. The alchemist looked up. Of course, he stood, taking one end of the brightly colored streamer from Gracia's hands. Ah, thank you. Gracia beamed. Just over there, if you could. As Albedo summoned a floating stone platform shaped like a four-petaled flower to carry the banner up, Gracia wondered if he realized how softly he was smiling. Apparently Winry had arrived this morning from Resembled to fix Ed's dysfunctional arm. Nina insisted on visiting Ed, so consequently, Hughes had cooed and asked Albedo if he wanted to come along. Albedo said yes. He couldn't very well leave Nina and Hughes unsupervised for the day. You're not pushing work onto Sheska again, are you? Albedo's eyes narrowed. Hughes made an exaggerated gesture, mock-affronted. Please. Give me some credit. I requested this day of leave a month in advance. Because. Nina hopped up and down in her seat, a bundle of uncontained excitement. It's Alicia's birthday today. Quote. I'm aware, Albedo said. You two have been talking about it non-stop, after all. Hughes beamed. Maybe we can rope in Ed's mechanic too. Her name is Winry, isn't it? I bet she needs a place to stay tonight. Albedo sighed, well aware that refusing Hughes's invitation, especially on the night of Alicia's birthday, would be nigh impossible. How odd. His facial muscles were still pulled into a smile. Winry. Can't you find a hotel somewhere else? Quote. Winry frowned at Ed. Mr. Hughes is being so nice to offer. It'd be rude to turn him down at this point. Ed grunted a half-hearted acknowledgement to her reply, not at all placated. Winry would have teased him for being so uptight, but she was more worried than anything. Ed's serious and set jaw was drastically different from his usually casual scowls. "Why are you so worried anyways?" she asked. "Mr. Hughes seems like a nice man." "It's not Hughes I'm worried about," Ed huffed. "How cryptic." Winry placed impatient hands on her hip. "Then what is it?" Quote. Ed didn't look into her eyes. It was a clear enough sign that to him, the conversation was over, but Winry had had enough. "Are you ever going to tell me anything?" she snapped. Ed slumped, looking more tired than any 15-year-old had any right to look. Winry wondered if she shouldn't have been angry, but then remembered that Ed and Al never told her anything, causing her more worry than necessary. She didn't need weekly updates. She didn't need to know every detail. She knew that whatever the boys involved themselves in was usually dangerous. She just wanted at least a word. She didn't want to lose the brothers. "It's Albedo," Ed finally answered. Winry paused. Her memories of Albedo from when the brothers had visited resemble. "But he's nice, isn't he?" Winry furrowed her eyebrows, trying to recall how Albedo had acted in resemble. Ed wouldn't be so worried for no reason, but Albedo had never seemed malicious at all. "And he takes care of Nina." Ed bit his lips the way he did when he was being stubborn. Winry refused to acknowledge that he looked cute when he so, certainly it was because of nostalgia. Instead, she did something just as familiar, and flicked his forehead where his eyebrows scrunched up. Ed leaned back, wincing as Winry smirked. "What the hell was that for?" Exclamation mark. Quote. Winry chuckled. "You're being stubborn." Ed grumbled indignantly, rubbing his palm at the spot she'd flicked. "Look," she adopted a more serious tone, "I don't know why you're so antsy about this, but I don't think he's a bad person. At least don't be mean to him in front of Nina. She wouldn't want to see two people she cares about fighting each other." Ed nodded mutely. Winry hoisted her duffel bag over her shoulder with a smile. "Good. I'll see you tomorrow, okay?" Quote. "Yeah," Ed replied absent-mindedly. "And don't forget to call if anything happens to your arm." She ducked out of the room. How much did Ed truly know about Albedo? Albedo was a skilled alchemist, possibly without parallel, able to practically defy the law of equivalent exchange on a consistent basis. Albedo was trained in swordplay, and skilled enough to use it confidently in battle, despite the fact that swords were far outmatched by firearms and used solely by the Führer now. Albedo only recently obtained his state alchemist certification, despite having more than enough ability to have done so earlier. Albedo had lost his teacher. And wasn't that confusing? Because it would have been so much easier to think of him as just a cold and aloof scientist, but no. He was too human to hate. It never seemed so because of the way he held himself, calm and clinical, polite and measured in every action. But his humanity was there, and impossible to ignore, especially when juxtaposed to the rest of his character. He was raised by his alchemy teacher. He had a little sister. He skipped meals in favor of little sweet morsels when he was too absorbed in his work, and he was the kind of person to stand lost in thought on the side of a busy road to think about where he was going to stay for the night. He valued books and knowledge over his own life. He had a frankly inspiring single-minded determination to help Nina, when doing so did not seem to benefit him at all. Albedo was confusing. But Al thought he was a good person, Winry thought he was nice, and Nina thought the absolute world of him. Maybe Ed thought so too. Albedo was a good person, and that was why Ed was so angry at him, because if Ed trusted Albedo, Ed also wanted to be someone Albedo could trust. There was no trust in the way Albedo had basically disregarded him that night, or in the too many to count secrets Albedo was keeping. There was no trust in the way Albedo said that he belonged on neither side. Maybe Ed could work towards being the person Albedo could trust. Being angry at him certainly wasn't helping. Ed sighed. As much as he hated to admit it right now, Albedo was probably a good person. A single isolated incident did not invalidate Ed's judgment of Albedo's character up to this point. Allowing it to do so would be irrational. But he still wanted answers. He would get those answers eventually, he was sure. Winry chuckled resignedly beside Albedo. The party poppers rained multicolored confetti over squealing toddlers on the other side of the room. She sighed. "You knew about this, didn't you?" Quote. Albedo's lips tilted into a curve that almost seemed like a coy smirk. "Perhaps." Nina hung back nervously from the crowd. She'd been shaking earlier, but sitting closer to Albedo seemed to calm her down. Winry looked to her left. Albedo was plaiting the sides of Nina's brown hair into a neat bundle at the back of her head, resembling his own hairstyle. Albedo seemed for all the world like a kind older brother. "You're good at braiding," she commented. Albedo nodded. "I do it for my own hair every morning," he explained curtly. She thought he would leave it at that. In all her attempts to start conversations in Resembool, Albedo had always given curt replies, clearly unwilling to continue speaking. She always thought it was a bit awkward, but he definitely seemed a lot more comfortable here. His posture was relaxed in a way that it hadn't been in Resembool, and his eyes for once lacked the hard glint of constantly churning theories that all alchemists seemed to have. "I also used to do this for my little sister sometimes," he added with a smile on his face that she had never seen before. It reminded her of candlelight somehow, subtle and warm, but fragile, as if a single wrong word would put it out. She couldn't help but smile too. Albedo took her silence as an invitation to continue, for once. "I haven't seen her in a while, and I don't know when I will be able to see her again, but she'll be fine. Clay has the others to watch her." "Clay, huh?" Winry grinned disarmingly. She felt briefly guilty for probing, but Albedo was interesting, to say the least. Maybe if she could find out more about him, then Ed could feel more at ease. So she said, "That's a lovely name. What's she like?" Quote. "Like a charged ion," Albedo replied with no hesitation. She was always excited and running towards the next item that caught her eye. Albedo neatly tied off the braid in Nina's hair, and gently patted her hair in calm repeating strokes. She used to really enjoy catching fish in the rivers. Exploding them and blasting them out of the water half-cooked already, he didn't say. There was a lot he didn't say. Like how she smiled mischievously when Cavalry Captain Kea came to pick her up so she wouldn't bother Albedo's research during the day. Like how she pouted when Acting Grandmaster Jean put her in timeout for destroying Mondstadt's local ecosystem, whether by accidentally burning down entire forests or having eradicated all the fish from a blackened portion of the riverbed. He didn't say that Clay meant clover, or that to him, she had been a shining four-leaf clover tethering him to humanity. She had never failed to be the brightest spot in Albedo's life since Rhindotter's disappearance. Rambunctious laughter from Alicia's young toddling friends filled the silence between Winry and Albedo. Even as Winry fidgeted with the hem of her skirt, she knew Albedo wouldn't continue to speak. His eyes held a far-off gaze to someplace Winry could not see. There was probably much about Clay that Albedo had left unsaid. Winry could feel the quiet and warm affection that radiated from Albedo though, she thought. It was somewhat endearing. For all that he surrounded himself with cold walls built meters high and layers of impenetrable courtesy, with the smile he wore right now, he looked simply like someone who didn't know how to express himself. "Do you miss her?" Winry asked. "Always," Albedo answered. Winry couldn't quite place the tone of that one word, love or sadness or frustration or a combination of the three. "Well, I hope you get to see Clay again soon." Nina swiveled her head around, careful not to jostle her hairdo much. "Will I be able to meet Clay one day?" Quote. Albedo patted her head with a far-off gaze. Perhaps. When he'd first arrived on this world, Albedo had made a decision. To research an entirely unfamiliar world would take time and effort. With a limited pool of physical and mental capabilities, he would only make considerable progress by devoting himself solely to one pursuit. Either searching for a way home, or studying this world. The latter reasonably outweighed the former. To venture into the unknown, especially one as vast as this world, was an alchemist's natural duty. It was Albedo's natural duty, because Albedo was created to be an alchemist and Rheindotter had taught him exactly what being an alchemist meant. The former was hardly even worth considering. His knightly duties could be fulfilled by Sucrose, and his familial responsibilities could be performed by the knights. For all that Alice had aided him in establishing himself in Mondstadt, practically speaking, Albedo was not indispensable to the city. Sentiment was something Albedo only ever partially understood. Sentiment pertained to alchemy as intent. Intent was creation. It was what allowed for the same alchemical arrays to produce different products. Sentiment pertained to art as the expression of emotion. Capturing emotion in art came down to accurately portraying the facial musculature in an exact position such that emotion could be interpreted from the expression. Sentiment pertained to Albedo as affection. Despite his limited understanding of the emotions that seemed to dictate humans' actions, Albedo was well aware that he was not immune to them himself. He knew what the warmth in his chest meant. He loved Mondstadt and its carefree air of freedom. He loved Clay and Alice and their explosive antics. He loved the Knights of Favonius for their duty and dedication, and Sucrose and Timaeus for their passion and integrity. Time had fostered interactions and experiences with them, and strengthened the affection Albedo held for them. He loved Nina and her shy, bubbly enthusiasm. He loved Maze Hughes for his uplifting banter and gushy infatuation. He loved Gracia for her considerate nature and Alicia for her innocent joy. He enjoyed spending time with the Elric brothers and discussing alchemy with them as intellectual peers. The longer he spent here, the more time would contribute to his connections here. The more he would cement his place here, like he had in Mondstadt. Amestris was yet another place where Albedo did not belong. Albedo was a stranger to this world and its history. Albedo was an outsider here, like the traveler had been. Briefly, he wondered if Rheindotter leaving him in Alice's care had been his greatest test. If he, a homunculus that Rheindotter had created, was able to make connections with humans, then he would truly be her crowning achievement as an alchemist. A created human so human-like that it could love. Mondstadt and Amestris could physically never meet. For Albedo to have one, the other had to be sacrificed. Equivalent exchange, one home for another. Perhaps it was selfish of Albedo to wish he could have both. Sketches were merely facsimiles of the locations he knew, but before the images of his beloved city could fade from his mind, Albedo wanted to preserve them. Windrise's statue, he labeled on one corner of a page. Mondstadt City Lower Plaza. Knights of Favonius Headquarters. Barbatos's statue. The Favonius Church. He paused on the last sheet. Clee's sunshine smile beamed at him from the paper, immortalized in charcoal. He ignored the fact that it was as ephemeral as the paper it was drawn on, that like a clover, she would grow and change and eventually wither and fall. "I love you, Clay," he wrote. "Stay safe." Chapter 8. With everyone gathered around Ed's bed, the hospital room was rather cramped. Ed shifted uncomfortably as Albedo took a seat in the bedside chair. This time, his eyebrows were furrowed more out of consternation than hostility. He really didn't want to apologize as Al insisted he should. So he started with something more neutral. He cleared his throat, stalling, "I'm glad you didn't get hurt at the laboratory." Albedo stiffened imperceptibly. "Thank you," he replied steadily. "Glad to see you have recovered as well." Despite the niceties, the tension between them was palpable. The sound of Major Armstrong clearing his throat cut through it sharply, bringing the room to attention. "Shall we begin, then?" Quote. Hughes hummed thoughtfully. "Armor-bound souls, a large transmutation circle, human sacrifices, and 2 people." Ed nodded. "Hold on, let me show you what they looked like." He thumbed the page in the notepad, his eyebrows furrowed in effort as he nibbled the other side of the pencil. His crude sketches of those 2 people in the laboratory were surely good enough, right? Recognizable at least. Ed jumped, very much not yelping, "Thank you very much." Albedo had been so silent that Ed hadn't realized he'd been watching over his shoulder as he drew. Right. Albedo was an artist. With a grumble, he held the notepad and pencil to Albedo. You can probably do it better. No, please, by all means. Albedo spoke with his characteristic neutral tone. I enjoyed watching you work. Ed gnashed his teeth, an indignant shout bubbling at the back of his throat. The sheer sass, Albedo even sounded as genuine as he always did, despite the ease with which he twirled the pencil now in his hand. Al chuckled as Albedo leaned over the paper. There was a hint of a smile on his face. Anyways, Ed shrugged. The alchemical array in the chamber matched what we found in Dr. Marco's notes. It was kind of familiar. Ed put a hand to his chin, thinking. Al, do you know if you've seen it before? Quote. Maybe, Al hummed. In Dad's study? We can't really check anymore though. Yeah, Ed crossed his arms. In any case, it's being pretty heavily guarded. Who knows what those people with the Ouroboros tattoo were? Quote. Speaking of which, Hughes leaned over the other alchemist in the room. I never get tired of watching this. Quickly taking form on the page Albedo held, the image of lust and the Ouroboros tattoo on her chest crossed her arms and smiled coyly. Beside her, Envy titled their chin up, wearing a grin dripping with malice. Truly fascinating. Armstrong cried. To think you were hiding such artistic talent, truly inspiring, Albedo cried Prince. Quote. Thank you, Albedo replied nonchalantly, passing the notepad to Hughes. Hughes rapidly flipped between the pages of Albedo's masterful sketch and Ed's crude rendition, then cackled. Clear difference here. Ed sputtered. Shut up. I'm not the artist here. Give me that, he snatched the notepad. Okay, yeah. He had to admit. It was really good. Rolling his eyes, he passed it to a still tearful Armstrong. Yeah. Anyways, he finished recounting, those two came in and things after that are kind of foggy from blood loss. He looked very pointedly towards Albedo. Your turn. Albedo took back the notepad and spoke as he began another sketch that Ed couldn't see. I went separately from Edward, hoping to find notes and records of experiments. Before I could, I encountered these two and engaged in combat with them. Hughes frowned, but everyone's eyes were on Albedo. One of them is called lust, and the other is called envy, he continued. Both of them have instantaneous regeneration, most likely catalyzed by a philosopher's stone somewhere in their body. When they regenerate, there is a byproduct of red alchemical lightning. Parts of their body that are cut off disintegrate into a black dust, so it is impossible to study the substance they are made of. Ed's eyes widened. Red lightning. That's how Albedo knew they had a philosopher's stone. You managed to get all that from your exchange? Well done, he grinned and mussed up Albedo's brushed back hair, but the alchemist didn't look upset at all, simply using his hands to pat his wild hair back down. The cardinal sins? Armstrong mused. Perhaps they are code names? Quote. Albedo made a quiet noise of questioning before holding up the notepad again. In any case, assume that there are more than these two. The sketch he set down on the table showed pearly white eyes on a large, stocky round figure and an unsettling grin. I thought the name, Lust, sounded familiar. It was during an encounter with this being, a few days before going to East City. It had an Ouroboros tattoo on its tongue as well. Ed's eyes widened. You did? Exclamation mark. When was this? Quote. A day before I met you and Al on the train, Albedo answered. I was in the town of Urbukia at the time, and it was running towards the north, if I remember correctly. I briefly fought it, but it escaped. And that was when we were in Leor, Ed's eyebrows furrowed pensively. Never mind. Continue, please. Albedo nodded. Envy and Lust knew that Edward was in the central chamber and broke combat with me when they thought the slicer would reveal something to him. I regrouped with Edward after following them, and thereafter they blew up the laboratory to erase the evidence. Ed slammed a hand onto the table. Brother. Al scolded quietly. We both know that's not all that happened, Albedo, Ed glared with fervent frustration. Albedo easily held his angry gaze with his own teal stare. Now, Hughes placed a hand on each alchemist's shoulder. No need to be like that. If Albedo doesn't want to share, it's fine. No, Albedo brushed Hughes's hand gently off his shoulder. Ed is right. I am not being completely forthcoming here. Al's eyes wavered, worried. Albedo. Somehow, the single slight motion of Albedo's shoulders up and down as he took a single breath felt as exaggerated as the deepest of sighs. Lust and envy tried to recruit me to their side using a philosopher's stone as incentive. Hughes and Armstrong stiffened. I refused them, Albedo continued. The stone's existence opposes everything my teacher stood for. I cannot use it. Armstrong was the first to unfreeze. Do you know why they were trying to recruit you? Quote. It occurred to Ed and Al that Armstrong had never seen Albedo fight, had never quite witnessed the miracles Albedo performed. To Ed and Al, the answer was already evident, unspoken, hanging in the air between them. Albedo meant something to them. Albedo was an existence closer to those of lust and envy than mere humans. The question at this point was not why they wished to recruit him, but specifically what he was. Ed leaned forward in his seat, anticipating Albedo's answer. Albedo opened his mouth, but no words came out. In uncharacteristic hesitance, he closed it again. Don't answer if you're uncomfortable doing so, Hughes interrupted the apprehensive silence. You didn't join them, so we don't need to know why. Albedo froze, the way he did whenever he was caught off guard, and finally nodded. Then, I apologize, he looked away to a nondescript corner of the room. I cannot say. Ed simultaneously felt the urge to kick Hughes, the wall, and himself. This manifested instead as flopping back onto the bouncy mattress with a half-hearted groan. He really wanted answers. To probe for them when Albedo was uncomfortable sharing was an asshole move, and Hughes was right, Albedo didn't need to share. But damn it, he really wanted to know what was going on, and his patience was running thin. Maybe he'd try asking Albedo again after. The sound of the door opening interrupted his thoughts with blaring alarm. Brosh and Ross were supposed to warn them if anyone was coming near. Ed froze. That was no standard uniform. His eyes trailed up slowly and all too nervously towards a black mustache and memorable eye patch. The nail in the coffin was Hughes's and Armstrong's immediate form-perfect salutes, backs ramrod straight. F. Führer King Bradley. Armstrong stumbled, but his voice echoed strongly. Perhaps it was fortunate that the Führer gruffed a dignified, as you were, before Ed had the chance to salute. He was never good at saluting anyways. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed that Albedo had not saluted either. He stood rigid, the perfect picture of attention. Ed could never look so serious whenever he tried to. Perhaps it could have been chalked up to Albedo's usual mannerisms, but Ed thought he looked far too accustomed to standing straight like so. Like he was not in a hospital room, but in an office, looking up to a superior. And yet Albedo hadn't saluted. Hughes bowed respectfully, a bit of wariness seeping into his eyes. What are you doing here, Your Excellency? Quote. Just here to visit a friend in the hospital, the Führer chuckled lightheartedly, holding out a basket with a plump melon. Thanks, Ed casually grabbed the basket before his mind could catch up with his mouth and arms. He stifled a sputter as he did a double take. The Führer was in his hospital room, gifting him a melon. Holy fucking shit. Why was he here? Right in the midst of their meeting about a government conspiracy of a yet unknown scale. This was far from a coincidence. He meant to surprise them. Surely, he meant to throw them into disarray, because there was no way the timing of a casual and purposeless visit would coincide with their organized meeting so conveniently. He'd already succeeded. Ed gulped. There was an unsettling dissonance between the Führer's relaxed stance, arms behind his back, soft chuckle, eyes crinkled in a polite smile, and the attention he commanded with his presence alone. I understand you've been investigating the senior staff members, Major Armstrong, he commented almost conversationally, a slight edge in his tone. Armstrong stammered, that is, how did you? Don't underestimate my information network. And Edward Elric, the Führer turned, his striking green eye opened. The Philosopher's Stone. Ed's heart pounded in his chest. Suddenly, the Führer seemed twice as tall and imposing. Simultaneously, a wintry chill ran down his back and his skin burned as if the room were an oven, yet there was no discernible change in the room's temperature. What have you found out? Depending on how much you've learned, King Bradley's single eye narrowed, and Ed sweated anxiously in anticipation of a threat: prison, being discharged, having his state certification taken away, anything but what he heard next. With all due respect, sir, Albedo answered for him, I don't think it is your business. Albedo's calm and unfazed voice shattered the uneasy silence, replacing it with an apprehensive quiet. The realization that Albedo had just directly spoken back to essentially the highest-ranking leader of the nation hit them with the subtlety of a sucker punch. Albedo Prince, the chalkdust alchemist, was it. The Führer's attention turned. Ed wasn't sure whether to be thankful that the pressure of the Führer's stare on him like a stranglehold had lifted so that he could finally breathe, or worried for Albedo, who didn't seem to have any concept of his situation's gravity. The latter won, and despite no longer being on the receiving end of the Führer's intimidation, Ed felt an increasingly intense concern clench his heart. Amidst this, Ed felt overwhelmingly dumbfounded. Surely Albedo knew who he was speaking to. Was he actually not aware who the Führer was, or was Albedo just that daunting? The Führer stood tall and proud, hands folded squarely behind his back. I've heard that you fight using a sword. Albedo nodded. Yes, sir. HMPH, King Bradley exhaled, as if sharing a humorless joke with himself. Would you like to test your hand against the Führer himself one day? I'm afraid my skills have gotten quite rusty over the years. Of course, Albedo replied in his characteristic unreadable stoicism, eyes narrowing as if to pick up the gauntlet thrown down. A spar with the Führer would be quite a humbling experience, I'm sure. I would be honored. The two locked eyes in the silent room. Albedo's gaze did not waver. The Führer abruptly broke out in hearty chortles. Ed took another double take. Just kidding. The fucking Führer slapped a large hand on Ed's shoulder far too casually. Don't look so defensive, the man grinned, as if he hadn't just terrified and scarred them all. Ed's brain short-circuited for a moment. Huh? Quote. Before anyone in the room could process this exchange, the Führer spoke again, more gravely. I know there is unrest among the ranks. Something must be done about it. However, he leaned down over the packet on the table. That's, Armstrong rushed to explain. A list of people who were involved in researching the Philosopher's Stone, the Führer finished for him. These men have all gone missing a few days prior to the collapse of the fifth laboratory. The enemy is always a step ahead of us. He set the packet down and stepped aside, looking pensively out the window. Even with my information network, as it currently stands, I have no handle on the enemy's size, their objectives, or how far they've penetrated us. In other words, Hughes noted solemnly, it's dangerous to be poking around. Indeed, King Bradley turned back around. Lt. Colonel Hughes, Major Armstrong, Elric brothers, and Prince. I've determined you to be men that I can trust. He tilted his head down and lowered his voice. I will not permit you to stick your noses further into this matter, nor speak of it to anyone. Under the present circumstances, when you cannot tell friend from enemy, you cannot trust anyone. Consider everyone in the military an enemy, and act discreetly. Quote. Ed gulped down the lump in his throat. However, King Bradley grinned, but the mustache framed his mouth in such a way that what should have been a smile looked far more like a humorless grimace. When the time comes, I will have much work for you to do. See that you are ready. Yes, sir. Hughes and Armstrong saluted dutifully as Edward watched, dumbstruck. His Excellency. Where is His Excellency, the Führer? A voice called in the distance. I will now make my retreat. It was an uncanny sight, the Führer hopping out of the window frame like a guilty child sneaking out of his room. I secretly slipped out of work, you see. Farewell. Quote. As the others crowded near the window, watching the Führer leave, Albedo stood aside, twiddling the white twig in his pocket between his fingers. Albedo did not watch Führer King Bradley leave. As a scientist, he was not inclined to believe in pseudo-scientific concepts such as intuition. By all means, the Führer should have been just a charismatic leader worried for his men. The inflection of his voice, his tone, the curvature of his mouth, every hint pointed towards a character of dignity, of nobility, of honor. Every hint should have pointed towards a leader. Like Grandmaster Varka or Jean, Albedo thought. Both Varka and Jean had held the same such charisma. They'd commanded troops with their heads held high and their swords poised for victory. The Führer's short exchange with him had not been a simple act of intimidation. The malicious intrigue Albedo perceived in the set of the man's jaw could not be dispelled with a light-hearted, "just kidding," or chuckle. Perhaps Albedo had been the only one to notice the distinct way the Führer's eyes had narrowed when they landed on him. The hairs on the back of his neck still stood, unsettled by a gaze that was no longer there but felt imprinted in his mind. A chill had washed over him, and his heart had beaten with a fervor he only rarely experienced. He'd never believed in intuition, but viscerally, he knew. Führer King Bradley knew something about him. The only question was what exactly he knew. It couldn't be his otherworldly origin, he hadn't told anyone of it, even the kind lady who'd housed him the first 3 days. It could be the fact that he was a homunculus, but it was unlikely. He had only told one relatively trustworthy individual himself, and though lust and envy had seen him bleed chalk, that alone was not enough to confirm what he was. The Führer would have already known of his alchemical knowledge from his state alchemist exam. If he'd been observing Albedo's actions, he would have already known about Albedo's unnatural, in this world, at least, use of the weaponry dimension as well. In any case. Cavalry Captain Kaya's third lesson. The walls have ears. He absolutely could not reveal any more about himself while he was in Central. Hiding information about himself wouldn't be difficult, surely. He'd spent years in Mondstadt doing the same, after all. Hughes sighed. "You're awfully bold, Albedo." "Thank you," Albedo nodded, unsure how else to respond. More like batshit insane, Ed sat on the bed, practically catatonic, making a pathetic attempt to catch his breath. "You do know that was the Führer, right? And you know who the Führer is?" Quote. "I am aware of this country's ruling structure, yes," Albedo answered honestly. It had been one of the first things he'd looked into upon his arrival, after all. "You agreed to a spar with the Führer," Ed reiterated slowly. "Yes." "Who?" Ed vocally exhaled once again, drawing out his breath as if it would help calm his beating heart. The opening door interrupted their thoughts. "Ed. I got the tickets you asked me to. Tomorrow at noon is fine, right?" Quote. Winry paused. Everyone seemed shaken somehow. "Did something happen?" Quote. "Ah, a storm just passed," Ed answered cryptically. "Uh-huh," Winry hummed skeptically. Quote. "Sure. Here you go. You're quite on the go," Armstrong commented. "Have your injuries even fully healed yet?" Quote. Evidently not, given the bandages still wrapped around his head, but Ed stood and stretched to look fine anyways. "How long do you expect me to stay in this disinfectant-reeking place?" He scowled indignantly. "Where to next, then?" Hughes looked at the tickets over Winry's shoulder. "Dublith." Quote. "Yeah," Ed nodded. "Al and I talked it out, and we're going to go visit our teacher." Al's rattling armor gradually grew in volume, cutting Ed off. "I'm scared after all, brother," his high voice shuddered. "I'm sure she's going to kill us." Quote. Winry deadpanned as Ed joined his younger brother in cowering. "Just who is your alchemy teacher?" Quote. "Still, it is quite a distance to Dublith," Armstrong mused. "Really?" Winry tilted her head. "Where is it?" Quote. Conveniently, a map was rolled out nearby from the earlier meeting. Al hummed. Around the middle of the southern area. Winry looked at the map, and promptly shouted. What? Ed's head whipped up to face her, alarmed. Rush Valley. She exclaimed, pointing to a point on the map just above Dublith. It's the holy land of Automail. Quote. Ed sighed as Winry's eyes sparkled with an unquenchable delight. I've always wanted to go there. Take me with you, take me with you, take me with you. Quote. Go there on your own, he grouched. Well, it's on the way, anyways, Al mediated. Should be fine, right? Quote. Quote. Fine, Ed rolled his eyes. Yahoo! Winry cheered with the energy of the sun in her voice. I'll go call Grandma. Quote. I wonder if Albedo wants to come with us. Al mused. Albedo. Quote. A quick scan of the room revealed that the alchemist had already left the room. Wah! Ed's eyebrows furrowed, perplexed. When did he even leave? Exclamation mark. Quote. King Bradley's steps in the hallway of his home were muffled by the posh carpet beneath his feet. You were hasty, Wrath. King Bradley stopped in his tracks, and turned. Oh. Do pray tell, how so? A sneer formed in the shadows. The chalk-dust alchemist already knows of lust and envy, and was able to track them to a precise location in Laboratory 5. Gluttony may be compromised, as well. Show some discretion. King Bradley opened his single green eye. He won't tell, he said with the confidence of a ruler. The seeds of distrust have been sowed. He would not further endanger his own identity so. Indeed, a red eye in the shadows narrowed. You will answer to Father for this if it backfires, however. Know your place, Wrath. King Bradley merely chuckled and continued walking. Hughes found Albedo sitting on a bench in the hospital's courtyard, staring straight at the sun with his typical unreadable expression. Finally found you. Have you been here the whole time? Quote. Albedo turned and nodded wordlessly. Maybe don't stare up at the sun too much, Hugh chuckled, taking a seat beside Albedo. It can damage your eyes, you know. This sun is quite large, Albedo noted quietly, almost whispering. That's how the sun is. Hughes beamed. Do alchemists look at the sky often? Quote. I wouldn't know, Albedo answered truthfully. He would not pretend to have insight on the minds of this world's alchemists, he hardly even understood the minds of Tevat's alchemists. That being said, the stars of Tevat's reversed heavens had never been studied in as great detail as astronomy had here. Celestial bodies could theoretically be harnessed as a source of energy for alchemy, but the conversion of sable energy at such a great distance to the Earth. Hughes blinked. You lost me at, no. I could simplify it, if you'd like. Albedo had often had to simplify such concepts for Timaeus, he was well accustomed to it. Nah, I'm good, Hughes grinned. I'll leave the hard science stuff and thinking to you. Albedo nodded. With the warm sun and peaceful breeze, he felt quite content. Anyways, Al wanted to ask if you would go with them to Dublith. They're going to meet their alchemy teacher there, it seems. Ah yes. The brothers were departing once more. In all the time Albedo had known them, though admittedly a short few weeks, they were so often in motion. Golden eyes and golden hair, constant travel, Albedo acknowledged that most of his temptation to join them was at least partially habitual. He turned to Hughes and shook his head. Could you relay to the brothers that I will not? Quote. Sure, Hughes nodded. They'd probably like to hear it straight from you though. I would prefer not to aggravate Edward anymore, Albedo averted his eyes. That, and, he didn't want to say any more. Even Sucrose and Timaeus, arguably the two people closest to him outside of his adoptive family and the Traveler, had never found out about Albedo either. While he trusted the brothers to keep silent, Kay's lessons replayed in his head. One person and two homunculi, possibly more, already knew he was not entirely human despite appearances. Altogether, 3 too many. He cursed his missteps that night once more. He had been rushed and careless. On Teva, the information had been dangerous. Any relation to Kenrya was watched closely by the Abyss Order and likely the Archons, and knowing enough about the nature of his creation could give anyone a hint towards how to corrupt his matter into something like Durin. Such information should have been obsolete here, in this world where no one knew of Reindatir, where dragons did not exist, where Kenrya had never fallen to their own hubris and the gods. Now, it was not. The revelation of his status as a homunculus meant that he would be watched by a dangerous, possibly pseudo-immortal organization able to collapse a large government-affiliated laboratory with no questions, no less. He did not say any of this to Hughes. Hughes did not ask, after all. Hughes simply looked at Albedo with a soothing gaze, as if he could sense the turmoil within him. I get it, Hughes put a reassuring hand on Albedo's shoulder. They're your friends, so I hope you can resolve whatever is going on between you and Ed before the brothers leave, but you don't have to. Again, just do what you feel comfortable doing. Albedo could well and truly say that his next two words were heartfelt. Thank you, he smiled. The smile would not convey everything. It would not, by itself, communicate his appreciation to Hughes for showing him to a reputable swordsmith, for welcoming him to his home, for accommodating his late-night reading tendencies and watching over Nina when he could not. By the way Hughes smiled back though, he supposed it must have been enough. Albedo heard familiar thundering steps, heavy metal automail filled by the hospital's standard-issued slippers, rapidly approaching him as he walked towards the exit of the hospital. He turned. Ed stopped running, looking only slightly winded. Albedo. Edward, he greeted back with a nod. Too many of their conversations, if they could even be called that, in the past few days had been punctuated by long and awkward pauses where neither of them spoke. I heard from Hughes that you wouldn't be coming with us to Dublith, Ed began. Yes, Albedo replied. I still have unfinished business in Central. I've requested more transcripts from Sheska to see if I can find any more information about chimeras. I see, Ed's eyes darted around, as if searching for anything to look at besides Albedo's eyes. I apologize. Sorry. Both paused, trying not to speak over the other. Should I speak first? Albedo tried. Ed made a casual hand gesture of agreement. So Albedo spoke. I apologize. It was not my original intention to be dishonest or hide anything for you or Al. There is just a lengthy explanation, and the information may be quite sensitive in current circumstances. Ed snickered, rolling his eyes. That was way too long and formal. Albedo tilted his head. Was it? Quote. Yeah, Ed leaned on one foot, crossing his arms. You could just have said, sorry, and I probably would have forgiven you anyways. Like this, he took a deep breath. Sorry. I was rude and angry at you recently for almost no reason. He shuffled his feet. See. Quote. Was that an apology, or an example? Quote. Just, Ed sputtered. Treat it as an example or something. I'm leaving. In your hospital gown. Albedo pointed out. Not leaving the hospital, dumbass, Ed snarked. Just going back to the room. Understood, Albedo replied. Ed turned to walk back, but stopped. Are you sure you don't want to come with us to Dublith? I mean, I understand if you don't want to, it is our alchemy teacher after all. Albedo remained silent, so Ed continued, albeit awkwardly, with a hand rubbing the back on his neck sheepishly. I just thought, never mind, golden eyes, golden hair, and a tendency to tiptoe around the topic of an alchemy teacher. Albedo remembered then that yes, he had told Al about Reindatir. And Ed. Meeting your alchemy teacher would be nice, Albedo admitted quietly. He'd made peace with Reindatir's sudden absence long ago, and he himself had taught alchemy for years. Seeing another perspective on learning and teaching could be insightful. I would have to meet you there, though. I did already request those transcripts from Sheska, after all. Great. I mean, good, Ed smiled uncertainly. She's kind of terrifying, but she's one of the smartest and strongest people I know. I see, Albedo said, for lack of anything better to respond with. Well, Ed turned around without stopping this time. Good night, Albedo. See you in Dublin. See you in Dublin, Albedo smiled. Looks like I'll be going to Dublin after all. Hughes hummed. You don't look upset at all. Why would I be? Albedo flipped a page in his book. A companionable silence settled between them. Are you leaving with the brothers tomorrow, then? Quote. Albedo shook his head. I'll meet them in Dublin after a few days more in Central. Sheska owes me a few transcripts. Hughes snickered. She's working beyond overtime at this point. Maybe I should give her a few more days off. Albedo lightly exhaled. Hughes recognized it by now as the alchemist's own way of subtly laughing. Perhaps if time allows tomorrow, I can help lighten her workload somewhat. Don't worry about it, Hughes waved a hand nonchalantly. Focus on what you need to focus on, we can handle it. Albedo looked at Hughes with half-lidded skeptical eyes, and Hughes failed to stifle a chuckle. Sheska can definitely handle it, in any case. She's a smart girl. Quote. Nina was pouting. Albedo hadn't spent much time with her lately, and though Gracia was very nice and Alicia was adorable, she missed her brother's silent company. I can't go with you today? She whined. No, Albedo shook his head. It would be terribly boring. I'm sorry, Nina. And he always apologized for not being with her, but she didn't want an apology. Apologies were just words, and words didn't always mean much to the ones who said them. She made a noise of displeasure in the back of her throat, frowning. I promise I won't bother your work if I come along. I know. Albedo knelt down so that their eyes met. Nina didn't usually like looking into people's faces, even though some tried to hide it. She could tell that they looked at her differently, looked down on her in a way that she hadn't experienced before she'd change. There was never any sort of disgust or disdain in Albedo's face. If she looked closely enough, she could sometimes even make out a smile in the minute curvature of his lips or the slight narrowing of his eyes. She liked his eyes. Albedo had very pretty eyes. If you're not here, who will watch over and play with Alicia? Albedo stroked her hair gently. If you really want to come watch me read for a whole day, I won't stop you, but you can do more here. As if to prove his point, Alicia, just got a warm hug from her father, giddily toddler over to hold onto Nina. Nina continued pouting, even though the feeling of Albedo's hand on her head had long dispelled her loneliness and worry. Fine, she acquiesced, but come home early tonight, Kay? Quote. Albedo nodded and stood, turning to Winry. Send my regards to the brothers, please. Safe travels. Winry bowed. Thank you for helping Ed and Al. And thank you so much, Mr. Hughes, for everything. Hughes grinned. Don't worry about it. Be sure to call whenever you're in Central, okay? You can always find a home here. I'm sure Alicia will miss her second older sister lots. Of course. Winry smiled. Here's the next transcript you requested, Mr. Cried Prince. Sheska held out a pile of paper. Thank you, Albedo said without looking up, eyes still poring over a page. Please leave it on the table. It was almost eerie how well he fit into Hughes's office space, Sheska noted, placing down the papers. He worked with an efficiency that Sheska greatly envied, able to multitask reading and processing information while giving and taking instructions. If Sheska could have done that, she probably wouldn't have been fired from the first library. Oi, Hughes called from his desk on the other side of the room. Don't forget to drink some water. You've been at it for a while. Albedo finished the page and set it down, pushing his chair back and stretching in a smooth and practiced motion. Thank you for the reminder. Sheska took a peek at the notepad next to the papers. It was filled to the brim with scribbled notes and revised alchemy circles that she didn't recognize. If Albedo saw her poking around, he made no comment. How is your work going? He turned to Hughes. Fine, Hughes hummed nonchalantly. I just need to. Colonel, Hughes's subordinate opened the door. Here's the newspaper. Hughes spun around with a grin. Thank you. Quote. Is that part of your work? Albedo deadpanned. It's called keeping up with current events, Hughes sang, wagging a finger as if he were a wise old man giving profound advice. It's useful, you know. Lots of scary stuff happening in the world, like the Lior insurgency? He pointed to a passage in the newspaper. Yes, there was a new religion, Letoism, or whatever, that was succouring the people, Hughes's subordinate elaborated. Seems like it's finally under control. Between Ishval and the insurgencies, the East is having a rough time of it, huh? Hughes hummed pensively. Not just the East, the man replied. There are uprisings and border skirmishes in the North and West as well. The bodies are piling up all over, aren't they? The government might just be overthrown before long, Hughes mused. Suddenly, his eyes narrowed sharply. Colonel? I'm heading to the archive room, Hughes said, standing. Hughes prided himself on being sharp. Not necessarily smart or intelligent. That was for the genius young alchemists to be, like Roy, or Albedo, or the Elric brothers. Those were the ones who were truly gifted, granted the ability to process, understand, and store information that Hughes probably couldn't even fathom. Those were the ones who soaked up any and all knowledge right before their eyes that they could. Hughes did not envy them. He knew where his strengths laid, and in supporting them, he knew that he would pick up the details they sometimes missed, put together the pieces that they sometimes dropped. Something like this. Why did he have to be the first person to discover this though? It was coincidental. He'd planned to let sleeping dogs lie concerning the Philosopher's Stone conspiracy since that morning when the Führer had come to personally warn them. The newspaper and his experiences in Ishval just happened to intersect with border skirmishes and battles, and now he couldn't unsee it. The circular map of Amestris had burned itself into his mind. It was coincidental, and yet all the pieces had fallen together as if fate itself had entrusted Hughes with this forbidden knowledge. Overwhelming dread engulfed him. He knew danger. He had known danger for the better part of his life, joining the army as a young man, training to kill, joining the front lines or Ishval among mass-murdering human weapons. At least then, he'd had the reassurance that the danger was as far as could be from his dear fiancée. Now, he had a wife and daughter. His best friend was working up the chain of command, and a young girl and alchemist, both of whom he cared for as deeply as if they were his own, lived under his roof. He could not afford to be in the danger he would now inevitably find himself in. He felt dread, and yet a traitorous bit of relief. He was the one to discover this first, and not the Elrics or Albedo. None of the boys were naive or unqualified to handle this, by any means. But the fact that they would probably be able to lift this knowledge onto their own shoulders with little regard to their own well-being was in and of itself the reason why Hughes hopes they would never have to know. They shouldn't have to carry the weight of a nation's future on their shoulders. Not at their age. This was exactly why, even as Albedo shot him a questioning glance from across the office, Hughes left the room silently. Albedo was deeply entrenched in this conspiracy already, and would certainly have to know eventually. Albedo was mature. Unusually so, for his apparent age. He would have handled the knowledge well, surely. Despite this, Hughes wanted with all his heart, wanted so much that it hurt sometimes, for Albedo to have a sense of normalcy while he was under his wing. He knew exactly where the large national map in the archive room was, even in the dark, with only the light of the hallway to guide him. He hastily fished it off a shelf and laid it flat on the table. Lior. Uprisings. The Philosopher's Stone, which used live humans as ingredients. The Ishval War, a circle for each incident over the circular map. Alchemy is always about circles and symmetry, Roy had once told him. There was a single moment of blissful silence in his mind as it refused to process the implications of the map before him, and then a rush. Everything, at once. The nation was how many years old and so near perfectly circular still. They'd sent him and their soldiers to quell all these uprisings. Did they know what they were doing? Someone had to. Someone high enough in the chain of command to direct entire legions of troops towards these bloodbaths. The door that he'd left open clicked shut. Albedo reorganized the pile of papers on his desk, setting them down before adjusting his chair. That's the third time you've done that, Sheska pointed out. Albedo knew. Is it? He asked anyways. It was already a few minutes past 8 p.m. He and Hughes had agreed to leave the office early today per Nina and Alicia's request, so whatever Hughes had to do in the archive room could not have taken long. 7 minutes and counting had already passed. Albedo stood. I'm going to go look for Hughes. That's a nice tattoo you got there. Hughes smiled humorlessly. Lust smirked coyly. You know too much, Lieutenant Colonel Hughes. Albedo didn't have a breath to hitch when he saw the trail of blood leading away from the archive room. Instead, he froze to his core. He felt the heart in his chest stop. The chill of dragonspine bit his skin and he felt a force akin to sudden lurch jar him even though he was not moving. Visceral terror struck him like a thunderbolt. Albedo did not believe in intuition. Hughes was in danger. He could point out each and every exact aspect that led to the single conclusion. Anything from the large droplets of blood on the ground that had to have fallen after dripping down his arm to the smear of crimson on the wall that Hughes had likely leaned his bloodied shoulder on. He could have and his brain was naturally inclined to so he did even though no one was there. But there was no time because it was Hughes's blood and Hughes was supposed to be glasses and kind grins and jokes. A neat blue uniform or clean-pressed black suit and never red, never the color of blood, and he was getting ahead of himself. Where was Hughes? Albedo immediately dashed after the trail of blood. The dim and warm yellow light of the nearby street lamp did nothing to subside Hughes's shivers. The blood loss was inevitably catching up to his body, even though coursing adrenaline was doing its best to keep it at bay. This is Eastern Command Center, the voice on the line said steadily. Put me through, to Colonel Roy Mustang, he panted, but did not hesitate. He trusted Roy more than anyone in the world. Surely Roy would know what to do. We have a rule against connecting external lines. The voice shot back with far more levity than Hughes can handle right now. This is Lieutenant Colonel Hughes, in Central. He snapped. I'm calling from outside because it's an emergency. Quote. Your code, please. Hughes grunted in frustration as he fumbled for his pocketbook. Uncle, Sugar, Oliver, 800. Quote. Code confirmed. Please wait a moment, the receptionist intoned. There was no way to convey over the phone just how urgent this one-call connection was. Hurry up. He roared into the receiver, even though the receptionist was probably already connecting him to Roy. The military is in trouble. Quote. There. The telephone booth, Albedo finally caught sight of Hughes. And behind him, a familiar but not quite her face raised a blue uniformed arm with a gun in hand. Stop. Albedo quickly shouted the first word that came to mind, stepped forward, his sword in one hand and the golden sparks of Chemia's golden stone flower alchemy already swirling in his other palm, poised to unleash the alchemy of the abyss upon his adversary. Hughes turned to him with wide alarmed eyes first and then the sound of a cocking gun behind him drew his attention. Put the phone down, the image of Maria Ross threatened with a deadly smile on her face. Put the gun down, Albedo threatened coldly in turn, and dropped the disguise. Hughes chanced a slow look behind him, at the lieutenant's too wide smile that was much more like a smirking sneer. Oh? The voice unnervingly deepened to a playful voice that was decidedly not the lieutenant's. How could you tell, Chalk Alchemist? Quote. Lieutenant Maria Ross has a mole under her eye. Albedo spoke too quickly, and despite his steady voice, his panic was evident. Now step away from the telephone booth, Envy. Man, I thought I got it perfect, too. Envy laughed in a sinisterly chipper sort of cackle, not at all fazed by Albedo's battle-ready stance. He tapped his cheek and with shuffling skin and red lightning, a mole materialized. Is that better? Quote. Hughes gasped, But Albedo was far more concerned with the immediate danger than the revelation of Envy's ability. "Step away from the telephone booth," Albedo reiterated, louder this time. "You'll be making an enemy of me." "Ah, how cute," Envy crooned mockingly. "The chalk alchemist actually cares." "But no," they shrugged, "I don't think I will. He knows too much. You shouldn't move either. These guns are awfully easy to misfire, you know." Envy could tell the exact moment that the chalk alchemist realized that the situation was entirely out of his hands. In a shockingly human way, his unshakable teal eyes just widened, and Envy could so easily see the sheer terror in them. But the alchemist was as foolhardy as the older Elric, and the odd golden light of his alchemy did not recede as he spoke, trying to reason. "Please don't do this," he tried. Envy barked a throaty laugh. "Do you realize how desperate you sound right now? You could kill me right now and you wouldn't, just because you're so pathetically human." He spat the world with as much vitriol as he could muster. "You should be above this. I don't know what the others see in you beyond the whole chalk." Albedo could see, against the faint glow of the street lamp, the glint of the small knife in Hughes's hand. He met eyes with Hughes. There was an unspoken determination there, a rueful smile on his lips, a blink that Envy couldn't see, a signal Albedo couldn't understand but inferred enough of to know that Hughes was not going to just stand there helplessly and be shot. Albedo's eyes widened. "Please don't do this," he pleaded, because at least while they were in a standstill, Hughes was safe, and even though Albedo didn't know how to proceed from there, a standstill would give his mind time enough to think and figure out a way to control the situation. To the backdrop of Envy's monologue, Albedo could see Hughes hesitate. Albedo could see his breath hitch and his smile fall. But then Hughes smiled again. Reassuringly this time. "It will be okay," the smile said. Albedo did not feel like it would be, no. But at once, three things happened. Before Envy finished speaking, Hughes whirled around with a small throwing knife wedged between his index and middle fingers and the force of a hurricane in his spin as he jabbed the knife right into the eye of the false Maria Ross. Albedo slammed his palm swirling with potent golden energy into the ground, and the waiting alchemical power exploded into four petaled flowers of earth beneath Envy's feet that blustered the homunculus with a mineral storm. And a single gunshot reverberated into the silent night. The connected telephone line beeped imperceptibly. Hughes slumped onto the ground silently. Envy's eye crackled with unheard red alchemical lightning, and even as they writhed in pain and tore the knife from their face, their mouth opened in a too-wide laugh. Albedo couldn't hear. His ears rang like they would after Clay threw one of her bombs too close. Albedo's body moved before his mind did, dashing to Hughes's side, slashing out with his sword towards the homunculus still standing there. Envy dodged easily. Their acerbic voice was too crisp in the deafening silence. "Look at you now. Where's your calm demeanor? Where's the cold stare? You're weak." When Albedo's mind caught up, the alchemy was already ready, swirling in his palm once more as he swiped a hand out and called forth tectonic tide with all the might he had left in him. Even without hearing Envy's screech, and even leaned over Hughes's body trying to discern the damage, Albedo knew his attack had hit, in the same instinctual way one knew when a sword struck someone. Envy retreated and Albedo stamped down the rising frazzled sensation in his chest. "Assess the damage, stop the bleeding if you can, bring to the deaconess or the Church of Favonius if severe, bring to a statue of 7 if not, because Barbados will bless those who live on his land." The realization hit him like a Lowatrel's heavy swing that he was not in Teyvat, that medical procedures in Teyvat were beyond outdated to Amestris, that statues of the 7 and the Church of Favonius and healing magic did not exist here, that his knowledge was utterly and completely useless and… "Albedo," Hughes gasped. "The phone." Albedo grabbed the handle of the receiver dangling a few feet away, moving as little as he possibly could from Hughes, and pressed it to his ear. "Oh," he realized with a detached sense of fascination, "I'm shaking." "Hughes? Are you there? Hello? Hughes?" Roy Mustang called. "The Nation," Hughes breathed, voice struggling to come out as if every word cost an insurmountable amount of effort, philosopher's stone. He's injured, Albedo said, because what else was there to say? Or perhaps there was just too much to say, and he hated that word, too. There was too much uncertainty, too much relativity, never any precision, but there was also no time for precision right now, and he didn't know how else to get to the point in a coherent manner. Who is this? Mustang's voice became instantly alarmed. Albedo, he answered quietly, quickly, Hughes was shot, and I don't. The words didn't want to form even though he knew them to be true. I don't know what to do. Take a deep breath. Where are you right now? Mustang asked steadily. Albedo did not take a deep breath because he did not breathe. If he inhaled and felt air on his lungs that were so unaccustomed to breathing, it would be jarring, and he needed every bit of his awareness right now. A telephone booth, the stone path outside of his office, 5 minutes, near the park. His eyes darted from landmark to landmark. Okay, Mustang sighed, failing to disguise how harried he was himself. Here's what you're going to do. Hang up, call 112, state your name and state Alchemist title, and tell them that Lieutenant Colonel Mace Hughes has been shot. Tell them your location and they'll send an ambulance. Do not move from where you are, and make sure Hughes stays conscious. Okay. Albedo paused, recollecting his bearings. Okay. The night passed in a flurry of lights and voices and instructions and questions. Somehow, Albedo's coat managed to remain completely unblemished through everything. Albedo didn't bleed blood, after all, and any of his wounds could be easily sealed with alchemy. His jacket could only be stained with the blood of others. Perhaps it was at least somewhat fortuitous that it was not stained with Hughes's blood. Albedo was the Chalk Prince. The Cried Prince. Albedo had been taught alchemy and science, how to understand the fibers of existence that dictated the world, since his very creation. He'd been taught to analyze every detail of every sense, to take what he saw and heard and smelled and catalog it carefully such that he would always be in control or at least aware of every energy, of every life, of every being. Albedo? Gracia's voice. Gracia's voice shook, and shaking implied fear, anxiety, uncertainty. Awareness became control. Control became comfort. In the process of this metamorphosis, knowledge facilitated the change from a piece of information to an action, from an action to a consequence. Nothing happened by coincidence, no judgment should be made on baseless intuition, every situation must have a solution. Albedo. Gracia's voice again, firmer, louder, implying worry, concern, still lingering nervousness. I couldn't do anything, Albedo whispered. Why, he wondered, did those words, which were so unnecessary to him in this moment, come so easily now? I was there, and I was unable to prevent it, Albedo whispered again. If he had spent less time analyzing the archive room, he would have arrived sooner. He could have watched Hughes's back as Hughes made the call. If he had sprinted faster, if he had attacked before Envy could lift their arm and the gun to Hughes's back, if he had exchanged his cooperation for Hughes's safety. Albedo. Contact against his arms, an embrace. The warmth almost burned to the touch against his freezing skin, and first he flinched, but it was Gracia. Soothed by Gracia's lulling voice, still shaking, still scared and worried, but calming and quiet and a reminder of warm lamps after a night of too many sounds, Albedo leaned. The world tilted a few degrees, and seemed to right itself at the same time. I'm sorry, he whispered. Chapter 9. The circle of life and death was a ceaseless and irreversible cycle, integral to the universe, to the self, and to alchemy. This was the first of many things Albedo would learn about alchemy. It was also the first law of many to be stretched and broken. To use chemia was to understand life and death on a deeply scientific level. Biology accounted, perhaps, for life, but chemia was the study of life's perpetuation and revival in circumstances where it was not allowed. It was the art of grasping at warm tendrils of what life should have been and dragging from it the wraiths that would be able to tough the unrelenting darkness of the abyss. Reindotter never asked if Albedo understood. It was expected of him to understand. In the lifespans upon lifespans Albedo had witnessed, he was no stranger to death. Knowing it was the key to pulling life from its brink, the key to Albedo's birth and Albedo's creations. He watched with scientific intrigue and observance as the energy of life faded from one of the many glass-caged creatures of his teacher's laboratory. He would not know what the word, brother, meant for many ages to come. He would not experience what the death of a loved one would feel like for many more ages to come. Albedo's fingertips itched from remnants of the alchemical formations that had failed to protect Hughes. Albedo had seen his skin lose color, his lifeblood spill onto the pavement, viscous and crimson and deadly. Albedo had felt the way Hughes's heartbeat had faded, growing fainter and fainter. It was nothing like when Rhindaughter had left him. When she'd left, it had been abrupt. One day, his teacher's heartbeat had been there, and the next moment, upon waking, it had disappeared, replaced by something foreign thrumming in his own chest. But he would still hear her, even as he descended the snowy mountain and new voices threatened to flush out the sound. He'd still heard her heartbeat, the still and steady sound consistent like clockwork. He'd heard echoes of her voice etched into the condemning words of her letter. Find the truth of this world. He'd never heard Rhindaughter's heartbeat fade. Perhaps part of it had stayed with him, in his own chest, so that he could never escape from it. Perhaps it had been irrevocably engraved into his mind. Perhaps the knowledge that Rhindaughter was still somewhere in that world, wandering, taking notes, researching, meant that he'd never felt the full pain of her sudden absence. He'd known it was imminent anyways, she'd always told him she would leave him if he failed. Had he failed? Find the truth and meaning of this world. Surely when a parent told their child such a thing, they meant for that child to live happily. He'd found happiness, and then had chosen to favor unknown knowledge of a brand new world above it, because knowledge too was a joy that Albedo could not sacrifice, for all of his principles. And then, within this unknown world, he had found happiness once more, and yet it slipped through his fingers like the particles of chalk that bled from his wounds. It faded from his grasp just like Hughes's heartbeat, which grew fainter and fainter and fainter. Hughes's heartbeat had faded in a way that Rhindaughter's hadn't. Albedo felt mind-numbing fear. Somehow, he always managed to fail. Fail to protect those he loved, fail to obtain information he needed, fail to live up to Rhindaughter's final wishes. Gracia's embrace was warm. There was something unfamiliar about hugs, Albedo pondered. Embraces were not a common occurrence for him, embraces that were long, that spoke volumes and multitudes of meanings beyond what words could convey. Clay had oft opted for tugging on his coat or his hand, or begging for piggyback rides. Alice had ruffled his hair, leaving platinum blonde strands in gravity-defying directions. Rhindaughter had taken those flawless strands of chalk-turned hair and plaited them neatly behind his head. Rhindaughter had never quite embraced him, but still he remembered her touch as vividly as he remembered the feeling of snow crunching under his boots. Hugs were dictated by an underlying ocean of known and unknown biological information and anatomy. Motor control called for the arms to lift and wrap around a figure, and muscles moved in accordance with the mind's design. Albedo had always found hugs foreign. Perhaps it was the way that human arms couldn't seem to bend correctly around his rigid chalk form, or maybe the way his own arms could never quite find comfort in any position around someone else. Unlike Clee's quick and flitting holds and Alice's burningly bright squeezes, Gracia's embrace didn't pinch at his sides or constrict his arms. It was something gentle, with the precision and tenderness of a potter tending to a fragile piece of something precious. She held him like he might shatter if she held too tight. She hugged him like Rhindaughter never had. Her heartbeat, slow, quiet, painfully human, reached his ears, overlapping with the echoes in his ears of Hughes's fading pulse. Eventually, it overtook the echoes, bringing something like calm back to Albedo's head. Gracia was alive. Gracia was alive, and they were in the hospital, the waiting room, with a slowly ticking clock and the subtly stinging smell of something sterile surrounding them. The world moved around him, people speaking, people breathing, people living. Human heartbeats were special, Albedo had thought from the moment he'd first stepped foot in Mondstadt's walls. They rose and fell, sang joy and sorrow, sped like flapping wings of a small bird and slowed with silent restful nights. They were nothing like his own, too consistent and steady like the pendulum of the grandfather clock in the night's grandmaster's office. Human heartbeats were beautiful, yet they faded in and out of his consciousness, in and out of life, with frankly alarming speed. Humans were only mortal. Hughes was only mortal, Gracia was only mortal, Alicia and dear Nina and Edward and all of them were, in the end, only mortal. Ah. Perhaps this was what Alice had meant, when she'd asked if living in Mondstadt was difficult, with a knowing gaze in her eyes that Albedo had not understood then. Albedo, with his hundreds of years' worth of understanding in chemia, really knew nothing of death. When Gracia pulled away, the hospital's waiting room with its uncomfortable leather chairs and quietly ticking clock joined his senses with a brief moment of unsettling and abrupt clarity. Albedo. She looked at him with red-rimmed eyes. Albedo could see the tear tracks leading down to her chin as she spoke quietly. "Are you okay?" Quote. He opened his mouth to say he was fine. His physical form had come out of the ordeal completely unscathed, not a single particle of chalk displaced, not a single thread of his coat marred, but this was not the answer Gracia was looking for. Without speaking, Albedo closed his mouth again. Gracia seemed to understand what he meant, her lips pulling into a thin near frown, eyebrows tightened in concern. She thankfully did not question Albedo's lack of response. Above all, Gracia seemed tired. Exhaustion etched lines under her eyes to match the tear tracks, and Albedo felt a pang of guilt. Whether it was because he had failed to protect Hughes, or because he did not seem capable of shedding tears for Hughes, or because Gracia had had to pull him out of his stupor just now, Albedo did not know. Her eyes did not stray from his for a single moment, even as he searched his mind for something to say to her. "I couldn't do anything," but that wasn't what Gracia wanted to hear. "I should have done more, been quicker, been smarter," but that wasn't quite it, either, was it? The crux of the issue was that Hughes had been struck down by, as of yet, an invisible enemy. An enemy that he and Edward had drawn out with their search for the Philosopher's Stone, an enemy they had been warned to be careful with, that they had not shown due caution and delicacy. An enemy Albedo had fought, insulted, potentially provoked. Edward was perhaps blissfully unaware of the consequences of their investigation, but Albedo knew. If it weren't for them involving Hughes in the mess they'd tangled themselves into the moment they'd broken into the fifth laboratory, then Hughes would no doubt be home right now, sleeping in his own bed after having read Alicia a bedtime story and kissed his wife goodnight. "It was my fault," Albedo finally said, and he meant it. His fault for causing it, his fault for not having prevented it. Perhaps he couldn't claim fault for what was out of his control, for Envy's actions and Hughes's last struggle, but he was a scientist nonetheless. He should have been able to predict it, if not control it. "Nonsense," Gracia rebuked immediately, hardly giving Albedo's words a thought. "Don't say that." "It was," Albedo insisted, frustrated. "You don't understand, if I hadn't involved him." "Don't presume that I can't understand," Gracia admonished sharply. "I may not have a scientist's intellect or a soldier's training, but I am not completely clueless." "I'm sorry." Albedo looked away. Gracia sighed audibly, her shoulders falling with the action. "I know. My husband got himself into something dangerous, didn't he? If he chose to shoulder it, he had his reasons. He is kind." She rested a shaking hand on Albedo's glove. "Be kinder to yourself. If not for yourself, then for the kindness he's shown you." Albedo nodded hesitantly. The early morning saw the sky painted a clean dark blue, too dark to be called day, yet not black enough to be considered night. Sunrise, soon, would come and replace the blue sky with a canvas of reds and yellows, giving way to bright blue and white clouds. Now was a transient moment of complete and pure silence, when the whole world seemed asleep. There was something beautiful about this moment, on the precipice of night and sunrise, that no one else was conscious to witness. A few hours ago, Albedo had shrugged off his white coat and draped it over a sleeping Gracia's shoulders. It had withstood the harsh eternal dragonspine winter, and could hopefully provide some warmth to her, even though Albedo knew the chill was not why she shivered in her sleep. And meanwhile, Albedo thought. He wasn't entirely certain how the night had passed, the vast majority of it blending into a sort of blur as he looked back on it. He had to have thought. In silence and alone in consciousness, there would have been nothing else to do, certainly. There were only dead ends in his mind though, trails that had gone unchecked and spiraled back into themselves only to end pointlessly, stoichiometric calculations for transmutations of no practical purpose, strings of elements and the transformations that led them into each other, plant classifications and the nutrients they would require to survive in dragonspine conditions. Everything and nothing at all. He was unused to doing nothing. There was nothing he could do. Hugh's life was out of his hands and in the care of professionals, people who had studied a field of science that scarcely existed in Albedo's knowledge of Teyvat. There were few medical applications of alchemy, and even knowing they existed, they had been of lesser value to the Knights of Favonius than Albedo's other research. Albedo was out of his depth, no longer the expert. Naturally, the only thing he could do was make himself an expert, and yet he had not moved an inch the entire night. It would have been pointless, libraries and bookstores had been closed and much too far for Albedo to simply walk to them. So he sat. And now it was early morning. He did not feel tired. Maze was alive. Unfortunately, he shows no signs of regaining consciousness anytime soon, the doctor relayed solemnly to Gracia. We don't know when he'll wake up, but his life is no longer in danger. Thank goodness, Gracia cried, in the softly reverent and relieved way only someone grieving could. Thank goodness. Your husband is a very lucky man. If he'd arrived any later, he would have, the doctor rubbed his neck sheepishly. Well. No need to say it, I guess. Gracia looked towards the young alchemist, who remained seated nearby, watching her wordlessly and expressionlessly, eyes not even lidded by any sleepiness. She'd learned somewhere along knowing him that even if his face betrayed none of his thoughts, his actions spoke volumes of his sentiments. She tugged his surprisingly comfortable white coat closer around her frame and wondered if he'd closed his eyes any longer than a few minutes that night. Very lucky indeed, she nodded. Hughes was alive. Hughes was in danger. Overwhelming guilt crushed by a crashing wave of relief gave way to alarming caution ringing in his head. The world around him seemed to phase in and out of his awareness as each emotion sapped something out of him, ripped the energy from his limbs and left him more exhausted than climbing a dragonspine cliff would have. Hughes was alive. There were no words heavy enough to describe the gravity of death, Albedo thought. It was irrevocable, necessary, and dictated by the natural order of the world. It was meant to happen in its own time, and not at the discretion of any human, lest they step into the garden of the gods. Albedo may not have understood death the way Alice had hoped he would, painful beyond measure, tearing a part out of him, terrifying and inevitable, but Albedo knew it intimately regardless, in the most scientific and clinical way he could. Albedo knew exactly how irreversible it was, and exactly how much and little he could pull life against its grain. If Hughes had died, Albedo knew that he would have been able to do exactly nothing about it. If Hughes had died, he would have had to carry with him the weight of another one he cared for lost, the weight of Gracia's and Alicia's sadness, the weight of a home rendered empty and solemn indirectly by Albedo's own hands. But Hughes was alive, and injury was reversible with time. Albedo hadn't failed them yet. His hands clenched involuntarily at his sides. But envy had meant to kill, and Albedo had no illusions of the fact that they only hadn't succeeded because they had let their guard down and taken their time to taunt Albedo. In the haze of everything going on the night before, Albedo had nearly forgotten. Albedo did not forget. He couldn't forget things, even if he wanted to. His mind was designed as the pinnacle of alchemy. They'd tried to kill Hughes twice. Once in the storage room when Hughes had stood up and went to check something, once at the telephone booth, likely having failed in the storage room. The homunculi were able to infiltrate the office building. They would certainly have no trouble infiltrating a hospital that, unlike Hughes's office building, had no soldiers roving its halls. There was no telling when they might come back to finish the job. Albedo was his last defense. Albedo, who could recognize envy by alchemical resonance, Albedo, who could sense when any homunculi were nearby. He alone was capable of protecting Hughes, making sure the life that had been tenderly pulled back from the clutches of death was not pushed back into its arms. Gracia gestured with a welcoming outfeld hand and a sad smile. "Come on, Albedo. Let's go home." Albedo, feet planted in the ground, silently shook his head. Gracia's face fell in acute sadness, that wasn't the right word for it, disappointment, and Albedo averted his gaze from her searching green eyes. "Are you sure?" she asked quietly. "Nina's waiting for you." A still moment passed in the early morning's silence. Albedo stood, unable to respond, frozen to his spot. He opened his mouth to say something. He wanted to go home and see Nina. He wanted to sink into the bed he'd grown accustomed to, wanted to sketch and take solace in deft control of paper and pencil, in old and new worlds, images of familiar and reassuring faces. And then closed it. He couldn't. Gracia retracted her hand. "I'll be back with some food then. Get some rest, okay?" Quote. Rest did not come, nor did Albedo wish for it to come. Sitting still and stewing in his thoughts made the world an unintelligible haze that unsettled Albedo to no end, but sleep would bring far worse agony. Albedo's mind was not designed for mindlessly sitting around for hours on end, with nothing to accompany it but a vast disarray of thoughts tangled with the memory or experience of pain. Or was it grief? Albedo did not know what to call it, only observed that it was not settling in his mind and fading with time as other emotions usually did. At first, Albedo had considered closing his eyes and resting, as Gracia had recommended. Travels with his teacher and later, long dragonspine nights rife with the threat of hilichurl attacks, had taught him to sleep lightly. He could certainly awaken if anyone or anything came into the room. A little-known fact of Albedo's mind, however, was that in sleep, he did not dream. He did not conjure the fantastical images or outlandish scenarios that only unconsciousness could foster. He remembered, replayed the day's eminent events, and reorganized his mind. He only closed his eyes for a few seconds before the ghost of a gunshot rang in his ears, a thud following shortly. Envy's cackling, alchemical crackling, stone striking against stone as tectonic tide manifested. He opened his eyes before the mental image had any time to form. He did not want to relive it so soon. Now there was nothing to occupy his time with, besides a pronounced task of protecting Hughes from further harm. A task of unparalleled stagnancy, paired with conflicting tension and anticipation. Would the homunculi return within the hour? The day? Wait a week? It was unrealistic and irresponsible for Albedo to expect to protect Hughes alone, and rationally, he knew this. Rationally though, he was the only one with a unique capability to sense homunculi. Rationally, he was functionally unable to die so long as he remained at a state within his capacity to restore himself. Albedo did not allow himself to dwell on the irrationality of his actions, lest he dredge up musings on the ambiguity of his humanity that were better left for another time. Hughes mattered to him, more than Albedo could describe. Hughes, who he'd hardly known for a month, Hughes, who opened up his home to him, Hughes, who gushed happily over his wife and daughter and Nina. Albedo knew there were lengths he would go to for Clay, and to a lesser degree, the Knights and Alice, that he would not even consider for the average Mondstaden. He knew he'd become affectionate in Rhindaughter's absence. He did not know just how much he cared, that is to say, beyond measure. The sun rose outside the curtains, and the long day began. Albedo looked up unblinking as the door opened, relaxing minutely when he saw Gracia. He didn't feel Envy's presence, but did not think to check her appearance for abnormalities anyways. Gracia was Gracia. For some reason, it was almost unthinkable to imagine Envy disguising as her. Regardless, if envy did ever try, Albedo had no doubt that they would be unable to replicate the way she smiled, or the way her eyes crinkled at the edges when she looked affectionately towards her family. "I brought some breakfast," she held up a basket. "Did you rest at all?" Quote. "A bit," Albedo lied. Though he had not slept a wink, Gracia didn't need to know. She took a seat and handed him a carefully wrapped breakfast sandwich, which Albedo gratefully accepted, realizing that he hadn't eaten since lunch yesterday. He chewed slowly, savoring each bite of Gracia's home cooking. As he gradually finished his meal, Gracia took out a blue blanket and mini sewing kit to occupy her time. They sat in calm silence for a moment or two. The steady movement of Gracia's arm pulling thread through fabric repeatedly caught the corner of Albedo's vision. Then, Gracia straightened in her seat. "I nearly forgot," she dug into the basket, where a sliver of Albedo's sketchbook poked out of the basket. It had clearly been handled with care, placed in such a way that the corners couldn't be damaged or bent. Gracia took it out with the same care, treating it as if it was a precious item. Gracia held it steadily towards Albedo. "I thought you might be bored, so I brought you your sketchbook. There were a few on the desk, but this was the one I saw you drawing in most often, so I hope it's the right one." Ah. This was the sketchbook that he'd drawn pictures of Mondstadt in, the one with landscapes and city scenes and portraits of friends. He tenderly took it from Gracia's hands. Albedo flipped through the pages, taking in each of his creations. His memories, crafted in charcoal and deposited onto paper. His home, his works, concentrated into a book. Albedo didn't realize when he had begun smiling, whether it was when he pressed a finger to the depicted alchemy table in the city, or when he traced out the shape of Klee's elfin ears. The pictures of home settled his thoughts and washed away the tension from his shoulders. They carried with them the melancholy of something dear left behind, but the stronger association of warm and lively memories, of learning and growth and comfort. This, too, was something Albedo had tried fiercely to protect and fallen in love with in the process. This, too, was something beautiful that Albedo hoped to maintain. "Thank you," he whispered, still entranced. Gracia smiled. Which came first? Alice had once asked him. The chicken or the egg? Quote. An illogical question, Albedo had decided. It was of little consequence which came first, because it was, on their timescales, a cycle which had no beginning or end. Theoretically, the evolutionary ancestors of the chicken had come first, but that was irrelevant to them. Ah, but there's the rub, Alice had giggled. I'm not talking about a literal chicken and egg. She'd held up her hands, grinning. Is it the chicken's duty to tend to and cherish the egg? Or did the chicken arise from destroying the protective shell of its egg? Quote. I don't see what you mean, Albedo had said. It still doesn't matter. Well, Alice had crossed her arms. There can only be one, since that's how the question is framed. If the chicken comes first, then it's a simple matter of protecting the egg. But if the chicken comes from the egg, then it is truly alone, having arisen from destroying the shell that housed and nourished it. So, I ask again. Which came first? Did the chicken love and protect the egg first? Or did the egg tenderly and unknowingly rear a creature that would one day destroy it? Quote. Albedo did not draw anything new, afraid that devoting his time to drawing would divert his attention from the task at hand, to protect Hughes. In any case, he'd drawn everything he'd wanted to in this book already. He and Gracia sat in companionable, if slightly tense silence, accompanied by the occasional voice and footsteps outside the door of nurses and doctors and patients roaming the halls. One pair of heavy footsteps halted outside the door, and Albedo tensed. There was no sign of envy, but now he realized it wouldn't be above them nor the other homunculi to send someone to do their bidding. The door opened. Albedo stood, hands at his sides, not lifted or ready for action, but poised just so that he could shift to a fighting stance if needed. Major Armstrong walked in with all his blonde mustached and muscular glory, and Albedo felt the slightest bit ridiculous. Young cried Prince Armstrong greeted, much quieter than usual, voice lacking its often booming quality. "I came as soon as I heard." There were a few unkempt hairs out of place on Armstrong's usually pristine blonde mustache, and telltale reddened moist eyes of a grieving weep. His uniform was not necessarily disheveled, but it was not perfectly clean-pressed as Armstrong usually kept it either. A quick but thorough scan revealed no signs of alchemical transformation on skin. Envy was not here, but overcautiously, Albedo ruled that envy would not take the effort to replicate subtle details indicating Armstrong's grief. Envy didn't seem human that way. Albedo himself knew that in Rhindotter's absence, he'd had barely a hair out of place, nor a crease on his coat. "Major Armstrong," Albedo greeted, falling back into his seat. "Thank you for coming, Major." Gracia stood. Armstrong waved a hand casually. "No need to stand, Mrs. Hughes. I'm here as a friend, not as a major." He bowed his head, saying with solemn sincerity, "I'm sorry we failed your husband. He is one of the bravest men I know." Gracia smiled sadly. "Thank you. I'm glad Maze has such good friends. Fortunately, he'll be all right, according to the doctor." Armstrong shot a sidelong glance at Albedo, who met his gaze in turn with a stare. "We need to speak," he hoped to convey. The major subtly nodded, returning his attention to Gracia. "That's good to hear." Exchanged pleasantries aside, Armstrong was beyond glad that the night hadn't ended on a worse note. Albedo excused himself from the room after the major, rushing to catch up with him in the hallway. "Not here," the major hushed before Albedo could speak. They finally turned into a less conspicuous hallway, eerily left in the shadows by the morning light. "Cried Prince." Armstrong leaned forward, concern furrowing his eyebrows. "Are you all right?" Quote. "It was them," Albedo started immediately. "They came for Hughes. I still don't know why, but they meant to kill." "I had figured," Armstrong sighed, long and weary. Cried Prince. "For your own safety, I must ask you to step out of this. You've placed yourself in more than enough danger. Let the adults handle this from here." Albedo shook his head. "I cannot, Major. I'm the only one who can fight them," he didn't say. "I'm the only one who can sense them." He hoped that Armstrong would be able to tell that his words did not come from overconfidence nor sentimentality, but from a position of knowledge. He alone knew the full extent of his own capabilities and the partial arsenal of their enemies. Armstrong, disgruntled, began to rebut, but "Please understand," Albedo interrupted. "Keeping me out of this would be useless, Major. This is not a threat for mortals to deal with, not a threat to be taken lightly." "That is exactly what I hope for you to understand." Armstrong crossed his arms. "You won't step out? Even for Nina's, Gracia's, or Hughes's peace of mind?" Quote. "I would never be able to," Albedo responded. To leave the homunculi alone as Armstrong was asking would be tantamount to pulling apart strong magnets. Now that they'd established a mutual acknowledgement, there was no separating his existence from theirs. They may not have been Rhindotter's creations, his siblings, like Durin or the Rifthounds were, but the kinship, for lack of a better word, was there. Even if Albedo tried to step away, he had no doubt that the homunculi would not let him. He left all of this unmentioned to Major Armstrong. The aforementioned man gave Albedo a long-suffering sigh. "Oh," Albedo also noted, "in case you were planning on giving Edward and Alphonse the same speech, the brothers will likely say the same," he added. Albedo had not known the brothers for long, but their tenacity was admirable, and their stubbornness was unparalleled. For different reasons, even if they were to leave this mess well enough alone, they would still be watched and targeted. Sacrifices. Albedo let the word sit in his mind uneasily, leaving it unspoken. He was sure he didn't need to say it for Armstrong to remember it as well. Armstrong hefted an even longer sigh. "Fine. But your involvement should not come to the detriment of your own health," he insisted. "You need to rest." Albedo averted his eyes. Gracia had instructed the same, and he hadn't fulfilled it. He couldn't fulfill it, and even though Gracia did not know he hadn't slept, he could imagine her disappointment if she found out. Rhindotter's glare after he came close to failing was always sharp and piercing, leaving Albedo's palms prickling with determination to do better. I cannot. They could be back anytime. Yes, Armstrong glared, but it is not your responsibility to protect Hughes. It was never your responsibility. Well, I can't very well leave him unattended, can I? Albedo snapped back, voice barely raised. What can a hospital do to stop them? How many poisons exist in this building? How many people can they disguise and infiltrate as? Quote. Armstrong stepped backwards as if physically struck by Albedo's words, and Albedo straightened, taken aback by the bite in his own tone. I'm sorry, Major, Albedo backtracked, regaining his composure. I spoke out of turn. No, it's all right, Armstrong exhaled. You're worried. That is understandable. They let the tension settle a bit before Armstrong continued. If it helps, I will assign guards to Hughes's room and do whatever is within my capacity to protect him. Thank you, Major Armstrong, Albedo relaxed slightly. But, Armstrong interjected, in return, you must leave the hospital for at least an hour. Albedo opened his mouth to protest, but Armstrong stopped him. Whether you think so or not, you need to rest. This is non-negotiable, cried Prince. Sitting in the same place for hours is unhealthy. You can't do anything against envy if they decide to strike, Albedo thought. Against any of them. They're not an enemy you can fight. And you can? A voice in Albedo's head intruded on his thoughts. What were you able to do last night? Albedo did not have a smart enough rebuttal for this. Alex Louis Armstrong had never seen the young chalk-dust alchemist lose his composure and raise his voice before today. Albedo cried Prince was unraveling, and Alex was terrified. He did not know how to stop it, didn't know how to stop the young cried Prince from burdening himself so. Though there were no circles under cried Prince's eyes, there was a look in his eyes. They were practically glazed over in exhaustion, alive with a slight spark of persistent purpose. If the purpose sustaining cried Prince's insomnia was guarding Hughes, then, Alex thought, he was a truly tragic individual. Touched by the talent of gods, doomed to monumental responsibility. Alex didn't doubt that Albedo had stayed up for the night, given the haunted look in his eyes. There needed to be a change of guard, if not for Albedo's own sake, then for everyone else's peace of mind. An exhausted alchemist was hardly a capable guard, in any case. A quick phone call later, Brosh and Ross had arrived at the hospital. Alex all but pushed Albedo cried Prince out the exit, Brosh following on the chalk-dust alchemist's heels. It was perhaps a good decision to assign Brosh to watch cried Prince, though the alchemist may or may not have noticed it himself. More than once his feet had stumbled clumsily over the hospital's smooth linoleum floor. He brushed his shoulders for a job well done, and returned to Hughes's room. Hopefully, Brosh would take over and convince cried Prince to go home and sleep. He's gone then? Gracia looked up. Alex nodded. I told him to leave and rest. He didn't seem to be getting any here. Gracia looked back down at the blue blanket in her lap. Good, she smiled sadly. I thought so too. Alex shifted his weight onto his other foot, searching for something to say, but Gracia spoke first. He really didn't sleep at all then, did he? It was not a question, just a statement seeking confirmation. Neither of us will ever know unless he says so himself, Alex replied hesitantly. Though I suspect he indeed did not. Alex also suspected that Gracia was holding back tears for the sake of propriety. He deigned not to comment on it. To the Hughes residence then? Brosh suggested carefully once they were in the car. Albedo had walked with great reluctance, and Brosh did not want to potentially anger him. No, Albedo said. To the Central Library, second branch, please. Brosh sobbed internally. Get him home and get him to sleep, Major Armstrong had instructed. Are you sure? Quote. Albedo nodded. I need to research. Far be it from Brosh to disobey a superior officer. All right then. After the chalk-dust alchemist had hung up last night, Roy had gone and bought the first train tickets he could to Central, for himself and Riza. The one-way fare was exorbitant out of his own pocket, given that he couldn't visit a friend on the military's payroll, but he had more than enough savings. More importantly, he needed to see Hughes. On the cusp of Roy's promotion to Central, Hughes just had to go and get shot, the idiot. Roy would give him a piece of his mind and then hunt down the person who'd done it, he swore. One nearly sleepless night and 2 long train ride later, Roy rushed into the Central's military hospital as quickly as was proper, barely stopping himself from running. "I'm here to see Mace Hughes," he all but shouted at the receptionist, who shrunk back from Roy's glare. "He's in room 231, sir." Roy didn't waste any time marching up the stairs and through the halls. He practically slammed the door open, ignoring the protest of the guard stationed outside. Guard stationed outside, one of Armstrong's, he noted for future reference. "Roy," Gracia gasped. "You startled me." "Sorry," Roy stepped in, his anxiety simmering back into calmer worry. "I came as soon as I could." "How is he?" Quote. "He'll live," Gracia smiled slightly. "They're not sure when he'll wake up, but it seems like he'll be fine." Roy sighed, relieved. "That's good. Very good. How are you? And Alicia?" Quote. "Alicia's good," Gracia's smile grew. "She misses her godfather." "It's been a while, Roy. You should visit more." Roy sheepishly rubbed the back of his neck. "I know," he paused. "You didn't answer my question though. How are you?" Quote. Gracia's smile fell into something more mournful, but still remained hopeful. "I will be fine. Thank you." Roy discontinued his conversation in favor of examining Hughes. The man didn't look right without his glasses, Roy thought. Hughes had always been a lively figure in Roy's mind, a light of hope even through the horrors they'd committed together. Hughes had almost died, Roy thought. Both men were intimately familiar with how many times a gun needed to be shot in order to kill, and both of them knew it was terribly easy. A single well-placed bullet could do the trick. Hughes had not died, but Roy was now past relief, bounding forth into cold fury. "Who did this, and why?" "I'll find whoever did this," Roy promised out loud, more to himself than to Gracia. "They will have hell to pay." He turned around and left the room, coat billowing behind him. Gracia pulled the sewing needle steadily through the blanket. Mustang began from Hughes's office and retraced his steps the best he could. He went to a storeroom, Hughes's assistant told him. Seemed like he'd realized something and needed to check it in the records. The chalk-dust alchemist went looking for him a few minutes later. The nearest storeroom was in a state of mild disarray, some books strewn about carelessly, tossed aside in combat or pursuit and escape. The streak of blood outside gave Mustang a foreboding sense of dread. Hughes hadn't been safe in his own office building. Whatever Hughes had looked at in the archives, Mustang doubted he would find it, unless the enemy were truly careless. Given their unreported infiltration, however, Mustang didn't think they would be. From there, a trail of blood droplets led him into the telephone room and then back out. The operator, distraught, managed to convey that Hughes had entered and left, and Albedo, a few minutes later, had barely peeked in before rushing off again. A picture of the events slowly formed. Hughes read something, saw something, something that triggered a realization. He went to the storeroom to confirm it, but was attacked there, likely stabbed in the shoulder by the height of the blood smear in the wall. He needed to call and tell someone, but suspected that the phones were tapped and therefore dangerous, so he found an exterior phone to call from. For whatever reason, Albedo had followed him to all these locations, but did not catch up to him, at least not until the telephone booth. The final site of the crime was not difficult to find. So soon after the incident, it still hadn't been cleaned yet. Dried blood caked the sidewalk at the edge of the telephone booth, and close to it, bricks were messily upturned in what Mustang guessed was the chalk-dust alchemist's doing. Albedo cried Prince had a unique sort of alchemy, see. Mustang had been fascinated when he'd rechecked the scene of his fight against Scar. Remnants of crumbled stone flowers littered the ground where the fighting occurred, elaborate yet seemingly effortless. There was no time to waste with beauty on the battlefield, but Albedo's alchemy seemed like art nonetheless. Flowers were a focal point of Albedo's alchemy, despite the title of Chalkdust Alchemist. Four-petaled, polished to glistening almost like gems. It was a pattern that appeared in more than just his combat alchemy. The markings of transmutation his alchemy left behind did not have the usual rectangularity of large-scale reconstruction, but rather appeared like smooth petals blooming from the source material instead. The more Mustang thought about it, the weirder Albedo was. Putting aside his unique alchemy, he was the picture of politeness, but seemed to lack some knowledge and social convention. He ostensibly dealt with alchemy pertaining to life, but performed most alchemy in stone and minerals. The perfect steadiness of his stance and gait and general mannerisms were not merely the act of a young adult feigning maturity, but rather seemed ingrained into him, maybe even trained, yet he'd lost his composure last night, on the phone. Albedo was odd. Mustang had known this, but only now did he consider the extent of Albedo's oddity. "Colonel," Hawkeye interrupted his thoughts, "I brought Major Armstrong." The aforementioned major saluted respectfully. "Thank you, Lieutenant," Mustang stood. "Major, I have a few questions." Armstrong looked too nervous to be irrelevant to the situation. "Bingo. Those who attacked Hughes. We have some suspects. Multiple suspects, multiple enemies." Mustang was looking for a group. "We don't know who they are. What were suspects whose identities were unknown?" Suspects implied investigation, which Mustang doubted was moving quickly enough to ascertain suspects so early. Likely something Armstrong, and perhaps Hughes, were looking into then. "I cannot say. No disclosure, despite Mustang pulling rank. A gag order, possibly from within the senior staff." This investigation was immediately veering into politically dangerous territory. Mustang did not feel any urge to back down though. "You're free to go, Major." Mustang held his hands behind his back, standing straight. "Thank you for your time." "Of course," Armstrong nodded, eyes shadowed with nervously sweaty brows, before walking away. "I forgot to mention," Armstrong paused, "the Elric brothers were here until recently." "I see," Mustang smirked. "And did they find what they were looking for?" Quote. "Unfortunately not. It is, after all, an item of legendary proportions." "I see," Mustang looked away. "Thanks," the philosopher's stone. Somehow, it was inextricably linked to the case. Good to know, but still a piece to the mystery that Mustang did not know how to fit in. "How very interesting." Armstrong did not move from his spot, hesitating. "Major?" Mustang inquired. "Another thing," Armstrong added. "Albedo," cried Prince, "he is in your care, is he not?" Quote. Mustang thought back to the shaky voice on the telephone, lost and uncertain, and nodded after a moment. "He is my subordinate, yes. If you could, please watch over him," Armstrong sighed. Duly noted, Mustang nodded again. "Is that all?" Quote. "Yes." Armstrong finally walked away. Mustang wasn't sure what to make of the last tidbit. Watch over, not protect, nor be wary of. It could have any number of connotations. For certain though, Albedo was the only witness to the assault on Hughes. Mustang certainly wouldn't be letting that go. "Come, Lieutenant," Mustang ordered. "We're returning to the hospital." Hawkeye easily fell into step with him. That wasn't much information. Quite to the contrary, Mustang smiled slyly. "The Major is far too unsuspecting, I tell you." Albedo flipped through the dense medical codex, absorbing the words as quickly as he could. His progress was unideal. The sleep deprivation had caught up to him, and he found his eyes closing involuntarily for longer and longer. Still, he managed to pull himself from the brink of unconsciousness by sharply inhaling, the jolt of cold air usually startling his lungs enough to reawaken himself. He went over a sentence for a third time, and then a fourth. Then he flipped quickly through the reference text he had open on the side, and returned to it again. Comprehension was not coming as easily as it usually did, leaving Albedo with a sharp and moving dissatisfaction in his head, frustration. The headache slowly building behind his eyes was of no help either. A pocket watch clicked distractingly behind him, and Albedo once again lost his position on the page, eyes flicking from term to term with nothing sticking to his memory very well. He resisted the urge to pull on his hair as he rested his temples on his hands. Was this what Sucrose felt on those sleepless nights in the lab when she went into study or research crazes? Albedo, Brosh spoke quietly, nudging his shoulder. You've been here for 3 hours. Did you find what you needed? Quote. Not nearly, Albedo clicked his tongue, not caring to hide his annoyance. Unfortunately, in his condition, he couldn't learn this world's medicine in just a few hours. Even at his peak, it would take him at least a week or two of full-time studying to have at least a rudimentary understanding. He'd only intended to stay for an hour and then return, but losing track of time while reading was not uncommon for him. He needed to be an expert. He needed to know exactly what to do to stop bleeding, to stabilize someone if this ever happened again. He should have known better, should have done better. But digging into medicine as a whole meant unearthing more than just emergency medical treatment. Diseases were counterable. Internal wounds could be operated on. So much existed outside of the scope of Tevat's knowledge. The Sumeru Academia could never hope to measure up to a world so advanced in time. He had thought it fun to explore in the comfort of Hughes's home. Now, researching with greater fervor, Albedo realized that it was also rather bleak. There were as many untreatable diseases as treatable ones, if not more. The vast majority of the country's budget was devoted to military pursuits and combative alchemical research rather than improvement of medicine. Albedo snapped the codex shut. Brosh jumped. I'll borrow these, he stood up. Then we can return to the hospital. Brosh followed as he walked to the checkout desk. Back to the hospital? Shouldn't you go home and sleep? Quote. I don't need to, Albedo lied, hefting the 2 books onto the wooden countertop. Chalk dust, Mustang greeted. Albedo's foot halted in the door to Hughes's room. Colonel, he returned slowly, examining the man's appearance. I thought you were in East City. Mustang shrugged. I took some leave to visit. Hughes is an old friend, after all. I see. When he ascertained that it could not be envy disguised, Albedo finally moved his feet and stepped into the room. He gave Gracia a tired nod before falling into the seat beside her, disregarding her concerned green eyes. I thought you would be with the Elrics, Mustang commented. Major Armstrong told me that they were here until a few days ago, weren't they? Quote. 2 days ago, Albedo replied nonchalantly, pulling out the book he'd borrowed from the library. They're headed to Dublith, I believe. Found a lead? Mustang raised an eyebrow. Just visiting their teacher. Albedo squinted at the words on the page. They were blurring together a bit now. He rubbed at his forehead, though it did nothing to recede his headache. You look terrible, chalk dust, Mustang noted as less of an opinion and more of an observation. Haven't you ever heard of sleep? Quote. Albedo rubbed at an eye, surreptitiously checking if he had the circles indicative of exhaustion around them that he'd so often seen on Sucrose and Timaeus. No, he didn't. Was he so clearly tired that it showed in his actions? The colonel hadn't sounded concerned or piteous so much as casual, though, and that felt refreshing. Like Albedo hadn't disappointed him. Sleep is inefficient, Albedo finally replied, turning a page in his book. You don't look particularly efficient right now, Mustang humorlessly huffed under his breath. He hadn't missed the way Albedo's eyes glanced over the text with no spark of understanding. Very well, Mustang thought. Armstrong certainly made his point clear. Watch over him, indeed. It was almost laughable that after seeing countless dead at his own hands, Mustang was taking pity on a young man who was unraveling at one near loss. The Elric brothers had seen hell and been back, but the teal-eyed pale-haired alchemist before him was an enigma with unknown experiences. Mustang couldn't blame him though. Personal loss was painful, and something Mustang had reckoned with before. He shuddered to think of how he would react if, unspeakably, Hughes had actually kicked the bucket. Fine then. Mustang would hold off his questioning for now, out of respect for Gracia and Hughes. Well, Gracia stood up. How would you two feel about dinner? It's about time. It would be lovely, Gracia, thank you, Mustang answered politely. Albedo? She turned to the silent alchemist. Albedo looked up from his book. But I should. Nonsense, Gracia interrupted. Nothing is too important to stop you from eating. Come have dinner. But Gracia was already pulling Albedo out of his chair. Mustang chuckled under his breath. Gracia was impossible to say no to, for more reasons than one. Come on then, she pushed a reluctant Albedo out the door. Let's go home. Albedo seemed to relax slightly upon seeing the guards stationed outside the room. Resigned to Gracia's mother henning, he followed behind her less hesitantly than before. Mustang was glad to come along. It had been ages since he'd had any of Gracia's home cooking, and he quite missed it. He was content to follow the relaxing atmosphere of Gracia's and Albedo's interactions from the sidelines. It looked quite comical, in fact. Albedo followed Gracia's footsteps like a duckling imprinted on its mother. Then, suddenly, something in Albedo seemed to snap. Albedo halted, frozen completely mid-step. If Mustang had thought that exhaustion had made Albedo's eyes look haunted, he stood corrected. Now, Albedo's eyes looked truly haunted, widened, crazed, like the eyes of a cornered animal. They're here. With those two words, Mustang immediately straightened into military uptightness. What do you mean? Explain. Now, he demanded, projecting a commanding voice. It's them. Albedo held an ever so slightly quivering hand up to his head. The ones who attacked Hughes, they're back. How do you know? Mustang narrowed his eyes in scrutiny. Answer me. Quote. I can't, Albedo quickly replied, voice almost frantic. I can't explain, but I know they're here, and I need to go back, now. Mustang clicked his tongue. More secrets and non-answers. Lovely. Who are they? Why can you not explain? What are you not telling me, chalk dust? Quote. Gracia tugged sharply on Mustang's wrist. That's enough, Roy. He hissed. If Hughes is in danger, I need to know, cried Prince. Gracia tightened her grip, and Mustang decided to withdraw. I won't ask any more, but I need you to be certain. Can I trust you? Quote. Albedo nodded gravely. I'm certain they're near, Colonel. Gracia's hand on his arm was shaking. Mustang examined Albedo's teal eyes and the gravitas behind them. No, Albedo was not lying. Somehow, Albedo knew something. Without further ado, Mustang took a pair of fire-arrayed gloves out of his pockets and pulled them on. The sound of military-issued boots thudding and squeaking against the hospital floor quickly approached. Mustang mentally cursed. They're here, Albedo had said, but only military personnel had come. This was becoming troublesome. Mustang could pull some strings, but he wouldn't be able to excuse assaulting this many officers on just one person's baseless accusation. They quickly surrounded them. Mustang pulled Gracia aside and held out a shielding arm, whispering a hushed, "Stay behind me." Halt! One shouted. State Alchemist Albedo cried Prince, you're being detained as a prime suspect for the shooting of Lieutenant Colonel Mays Hughes. Any attempt to resist will. Within the blink of an eye, Albedo somehow procured a sword and leveled its point at the neck of the officer beside him. Golden alchemical energy swirled at his other hand, barely noticeable unless one was looking for it. Simultaneously, 5 guns clicked in warning, barrels raised and locked onto Albedo. Mustang squinted. That didn't seem like alchemy, but there was hardly anything else it could be. A sword, out of seemingly nowhere, without even a clap. No circle existing would allow him to pull metal from thin air. Please, officers, there must be some kind of mistake. Gracia tried to interject, but Mustang shushed her fiercely. There was a moment of standstill. The officer threatened, looking down his nose at Albedo, whose glare was filled with vitriol. Mustang had never seen him so angry before. Then, finally, the officer pinched the blade between thumb and forefinger, slowly moving it away from his neck. Albedo stiffened and took one step back, but the sword was held still. Expressionlessly, the man leaned forward and whispered something into Albedo's ear. Albedo's eyes widened. Mustang carefully watched the interaction with mounting confusion and suspicion. The officer held up a hand, and tentatively, the other officers put down their guns. Then, in a burst of golden sparks, Albedo's sword dematerialized from his hand. Now was that so difficult? The officer tilted his head up, looking down at Albedo with derision and, if Mustang was reading him correctly, slight amusement. No one has to get hurt, Alchemist. Albedo continued wordlessly glaring as the officer clapped a heavy hand on Albedo's shoulder and pushed him towards the exit. Pardon the intrusion, the officer dryly remarked as all the officers turned and followed them out. The noise left with their footsteps, leaving behind only a moment of silent emptiness. Behind Mustang, Gracia collapsed unceremoniously on the ground. Mustang held her forearms, attempting to help her up, but her legs failed her. This is wrong, she pulled away and held her own arms, trying to brace herself. They're wrong, Roy, please, she took a shaky deep breath. Help him. He wouldn't. Mustang nodded without promising anything. He wouldn't, she said. Right now, at least, Mustang was inclined to believe her. Albedo's panic had seemed too real to be fake, both over the phone and just now. But that aside, Albedo was looking more and more suspicious. He'd gone willingly with the officer after their little exchange. They hadn't even placed him in cuffs. What had the officer said to get Albedo to put down his sword? Too much about him didn't add up. Roy drove a distraught Gracia home, apologized that he couldn't stay for dinner, and then returned immediately back to the hospital, where Lieutenant Hawkeye was still waiting. Sir, she saluted as he came into view. Mustang wasted no time on pleasantries. Find me everything you can pertaining to Albedo, cried Prince. Do it under the radar, he ordered. This is of utmost importance. Understood, sir, Hawkeye nodded. Where's brother Albedo? Nina asked Gracia, skipping all greetings. He hasn't been home since yesterday morning. He said he'd be home early yesterday. Why isn't he back? Quote. Gracia stifled something like a sob, not letting it exit her chest. He'll be back soon, she stuttered. In no time. You'll see. Nina, for lack of a better word, pouted. Quote. I don't believe you. I wouldn't believe myself either, Gracia thought. How about some dinner? She evaded the topic. Have you girls eaten yet? Quote. Nina cocked her head but did not comment on the sharp change of subject. Yeah, Ms. Meyer helped us heat up the quiche. Dessert then, Gracia pushed the chipperness in her voice past the urge to cry. Let's have some peanut butter cookies. Nina, could you go get Alicia? Quote. Albedo had truly taken for granted the easygoing peace that Mondstadt had shown in its everyday life. Though the Knights of Favonius were, for most purposes, Mondstadt's main military unit, the extent of combat they were called for was usually the occasional stray hilichurl, and on rare occasion, hilichurl camps that had come too close to some settlements. The Knights were by no means a large organization, nor an authority. They trusted the citizens of Mondstadt to maintain their own peace and freedom, and mostly dealt with exterior threats. The dirtiest hands among the knights likely belonged to Kea and those subordinates within the cavalry that followed in his footsteps, taming the abyss and striking at the underbelly of the treasure hoarders that would dare to step foot beyond Liu into Mond. Thus, there were hardly ever situations such as the one Albedo found himself in now, where internal investigation led to interrogation for one of their knights. Knight recruitment was strict and reserved only for those who showed utmost loyalty to Mondstadt, after all. Albedo himself had only gotten in on Alice's recommendation. He supposed he'd perhaps been isolated from any unpleasant workings within Mondstadt by spending most of his time on Dragonspine, anyways. Arrest and interrogation was something he'd heard about from Kea's drunken rants at Angel's Share, but he'd never seen nor experienced it. He mused on this, sitting silently in the bleak questioning room they'd brought him to. Envy's presence poked the edge of his mind, leaving Albedo restless and uneasy. Had he made the right decision? Was this only a ploy to remove him from his position and kill Hughes while he was detained? The homunculi did not seem the type to keep their word. "Relax, Chalky," Envy whispered into Albedo's ear, smirking. "We're only here for you. The old man can live for now. So, come peacefully, or my hand might just slip." They glanced surreptitiously at Gracia, and then flicked their eyes back. "What'll it be?" Quote. Thus far, Envy hadn't left the range where Albedo could sense them. That they were nowhere near Hughes, at least, was a small comfort. The heavy door clicked open, and Envy, still disguised as an officer, walked in, followed by another broad-shouldered man. Albedo glared as they took their seats across from him. The harsh white light illuminated the upward-facing planes of their faces in high contrast, giving their features a heavy-set gravity. "Why don't you tell us what happened last night?" The officer that wasn't Envy spoke. Albedo continued wordlessly glaring. "If you remain silent, it will be assumed as a guilty plea." The officer slammed a hand down on the table. Envy tilted their head up to look down on him. "Humorous, why don't you, Mr. State Alchemist?" "Fine." Albedo leveled a neutral and indifferent gaze at the officer to counter their unwavering stare. "Hughes left the office a few minutes past 8, he recounted monotonously. "He went to the records room to check something, and didn't come back, so I went looking for him and found his blood on the wall. From a stab wound in his shoulder, yes." The officer continued staring unsettlingly into Albedo's eyes. "Continue." "I followed his trail of blood to the telephone room, and then out of the building until I reached the telephone booth, and Envy was there, holding a gun to his head." Albedo froze mid-sentence. Envy was a homunculus, a being outside the realm of what many humans thought possible. "I can't describe them without sounding like a lunatic," Albedo realized, and Envy knew as well, judging by the demeaning smirk on their borrowed face. "Well, out with it," the officer prodded. What could Albedo say? Literally describing his memory was out of the question, since Envy had borrowed Second Lieutenant Ross's face for most of the encounter and Albedo refused to involve her. Lie and make up a false perpetrator. Or describe Envy's default appearance, a teenager of ambiguous gender wearing only a crop top and miniskirt. The officer would think Albedo was joking. With no options left, Albedo quietly spoke. "I cannot say." "What was that?" The officer leaned forward. "I cannot say," Albedo repeated, louder. "I don't think you understand, Mr. Krytoprins." The man folded his hands together calmly, resting them under his chin. "If you do not speak, you are the prime suspect and will have to assume responsibility for this crime." Albedo could not afford to be imprisoned in this world. Nina came to his mind unbidden, she was his dependent. If he were arrested, she would be returned to the state, subject to experimentation. But an outlandish testimony would land him in a cell regardless. Albedo, with growing horror, realized that there was no way out of this, and that in coming willingly, he'd walked himself to his own downfall. Envy looked positively gleeful. "Case closed." Then, the officer clapped, startling Albedo. But Hughes was shot, Albedo tried uselessly, voice a little too quick and defensive. "I don't have a gun. It would be child's play for you, a state alchemist, to borrow one from a lesser officer, citing emergency purposes." The bullet was 8.45 caliber, matching standard military-issued handguns, the officer rebutted. "Not to mention, he was stabbed, and you happen to be the only alchemist with the ability to pull a sword from out of nowhere." "My sword is clean," Albedo argued. "It has no blood on it, because he'd only used it to fight the homunculi in the 5th laboratory and their homuncular blood turned into ashes and disappeared. You could have cleaned it. And what's to say you don't create your sword anew whenever you use it? That is not admissible evidence." Albedo opened his mouth to contend, but had nothing to say. You had the means to do it, the officer continued. No evidence, no alibi, we'll see about the motive. Why was Hughes stabbed and shot, Mr. Prince? Quote. Don't ask me, Albedo glared fiercely across the table to where Envy lounged quietly on their chair. I didn't do it. Then whose fault was it? Quote. I cannot say. Speak, Mr. Prince. You've been warned. I cannot say. Was it, or was it not your fault? Quote. Albedo paused, but his sleep deprivation-addled mind answered for him. It was my fault for getting him involved, but... So you admit guilt? Quote. No. It was them. Albedo lost his patience spectacularly and pointed towards Envy, who continued smirking, unfazed. Please keep the jokes to a minimum, Mr. Prince, the officer remarked, unimpressed. In any case, it seems we're done here. He stood, and Albedo stared, exhausted, as he exited the room, leaving Albedo alone with Envy. Envy clapped slowly, every sound echoing and magnifying itself in the small room until Albedo's ears rang. The crackle of red lightning filled and echoed throughout the diminutive room, Envy's usual green-haired appearance unfurling from head to toe. Magnificent show, Chalky. Truly magnificent. Albedo did not grace them with a response, but fell deep into his seat with a twisted sense of relief, knowing that the pretenses were over. What was the point of this, Envy? Quote. Making a point, Envy gave a sinister grin. Really, you played your part wonderfully. Didn't even need cues to know what to say. They leaned forward and into Albedo's range of discomfort. Albedo shrunk backwards uneasily. Good on you for realizing so quickly that you can't say anything about us. Because you're one too, aren't you? Quote. Don't put me on the same level as you. Albedo rose to their challenge, glaring straight into Envy's purple eyes. He was a creation of Rhindotir, her magnum opus. Feisty, Envy chuckled, then leaned back. This is the bad end. They sang. You get arrested. We kill Hughes and take back that chimera dog girl, and you get to rot in a cell for the rest of your pitiful existence. Albedo stood and readied his hand for calling his weapon, the metal chair behind him squeaking terribly against the floor. I won't let that happen. I'm not finished, Envy raised an eyebrow, voice low and humorless. Sit down. You're swaying. And so he was. Albedo's legs were shaky with dozens of hours of lost sleep, and standing up so suddenly had left black spots dancing in his vision that weren't clearing quickly enough. He hesitantly sat back down, recognizing his position, but was still ready to attack. Or, you can just follow a few of our conditions, and we'll let you continue traveling and leave Hughes alone like nothing ever happened. Capiche? They grinned. I already said I won't work with you, Albedo replied. Why do you think I'll cooperate now? Quote. Because you don't have a leg to stand on, Envy rolled their eyes. Keep up, will you? We could take away everything you so pathetically care about in this world, so it really would be in your best interest. Envy was correct. Albedo grit his teeth. What are your conditions? He asked, finally. Good, good. You're finally getting it, Envy cackled. For now, don't fight us, don't tell anyone about us, and don't tell anyone about this arrangement. We won't even ask you to kill anyone. Good deal, isn't it? Quote. Albedo narrowed his eyes. It was almost too good of a deal. That's all. Quote. Yep, Envy popped the P. Take it as a favor. Believe it or not, Chalky, the others actually want to help you a bit. Crazy, isn't it? Can't imagine why. Albedo's eyebrows furrowed. Why would? Beats me, Envy shrugged. I wanna beat you to a pulp, anyways. I appreciate the honesty, Albedo deadpanned. In the interest of honesty, I also want to stab you. Many times. Ouch, Envy grinned. Good thing you can't then, huh? Quote. I haven't agreed yet. But you will, Envy leered derisively. And again, Envy was correct. Albedo would. Shake on it, Envy held out a hand. Albedo looked at the hand, and saw his only option. The only way to keep Hughes and Nina safe, the only way to ensure with his own power that they would remain out of danger. He put his hand forward, and shook Envy's hand, disgusted. This is the hand that nearly killed Hughes, he thought over and over again. As their hands pulled apart, Envy quickly snaked their fingers around Albedo's wrist, gripping so tightly that if Albedo tried to pull his arm away, he would have lost a hand. Albedo hissed. "What are you?" Envy deftly twisted the arm, maneuvering Albedo's hand so that his palm faced upward, and dropped a red spherical stone into it. A philosopher's stone. Albedo's protest died on his tongue, because a rolling sickness made his stomach lurch at the sight of it. Human souls compressed and crystallized. Suddenly, he felt nauseous. A show of goodwill, Envy smirked, fully aware of Albedo's discomfort. "From us to you. Use it to cure that chimera girl or something." "No," Albedo immediately refused. "Take it back. I don't want it." Too late, Envy released his wrist with a forceful shove. "It's in your hands now, Alchemist. Throw it away if you don't want it." Throwing it away was out of the question. Using it was out of the question. "See you later, Chalkdust Alchemist," they sneered, and in a smooth motion spread out like fine scales reflecting light on a fish. Red lightning followed a trail of alchemical transformation along their body. Once again, they were a nondescript officer. "Your charges are clear. You're free to go." Albedo closed his fist carefully around the stone and tucked it into the inner pocket of his coat. "Damn you, Envy." Gracia perked up at the sound of a knock on the door. This late, there were only a few people it could reasonably be. She made her way to the door, and... Oh. Albedo stood there. "I'm back," he smiled with that small subtle smile he reserved for their home. She immediately hugged him. To make sure it was real, to calm herself, to give him comfort. "Welcome back." This time, she didn't bother holding back her tears. Gracia had fed him dinner and herded him to bed as soon as he stepped foot through the doorway. Gracia knew exactly what she was doing when she made him look at Nina, curled up on his bed and hugging his pillow. "She missed you," Gracia chided softly. "You'd better apologize to her and make it right in the morning." "Go sleep, Albedo." Albedo nodded in agreement. He was glad to fall into the plush mattress and thick covers after the sheer whirlwind of exhaustion the day had brought. Click. Boom. Hughes's body fell. Envy screamed in pain. Albedo's mouth opened in a silent cry he didn't remember hearing. Thud. Albedo rewound the image. Hughes arose, a knife pulled out of Envy's face and a gun flew back to their hand. Albedo stood still. Hughes's comforting smile rose to the forefront, magnified. Time progressed once more in slow motion. Albedo opened his mouth to plea, but no sound came out. Click. Boom. Hughes's body fell, slower and slower, approaching yellow brick asymptomatically, never reaching it. Envy lurched back, face twisted mid-scream and mid-cackle, red lightning obscuring their features. Albedo's step forward never reached the ground, alchemical energy holding itself still in frozen time. Time came undone once more as Albedo rewound the image. Click. Boom. The bullet tore through blue fabric and a wellspring of crimson followed in its wake. Hughes's body descended, his right knee failing first, his fall tilted outwards from the booth. His hazel eyes widened unblinkingly, a drop of sweat on his brow. The knife lodged itself into Envy's eye, a look of excruciating pain suspended on their face. Ross's face, tiles of alchemic transmutation crawling across skin as the form of Ross ebbed and the form of Envy replaced it. Albedo was just a few steps away from the telephone booth, from Hughes and Envy. A few steps away was not near enough. His unused sword weighed heavily in his hand, but his arm couldn't fall. If his sword had been quicker, if he'd unleashed the alchemy at his fingertips sooner, if he'd stopped closer. A soundless shout tore itself from Albedo's throat. Back, again. Back, again. Hughes stood in the telephone booth. Envy stood behind him, raising a gun. Albedo ran. Click, boom. Nothing changed. These were, after all, only memories. Albedo opened his eyes. Nina was fiercely shaking his arm with her clumsy furred hands, movements quick with panic and worry. She stopped as Albedo sat up and looked at her. "Did I wake you?" Albedo asked quietly. She nodded shakily. He rested a still hand on her head, gently patting her hair. "I'm sorry, Nina. Go back to sleep. Are you okay?" Nina asked. She stepped aside as Albedo smoothly swung his legs over the side of the line bed and stood. "I'll be fine. I'm going to go make some tea." Nina tilted her head inquisitively. "I thought tea woke you up." Albedo smiled and walked towards the door. "Not all tea. I'll make one to help me sleep." "You should be sleeping, Nina." "Okay," she agreed slightly groggily. Judging by the moonlight, Albedo guessed that it was around 2:30, a terrible time for Nina to be awake. She seemed too tired to disagree, jumping easily back into her own bed. "Good night, then." "Good night," Albedo whispered. The kitchen light was on already, the warm glow unusually bright in the middle of the night. Around the corner, Gracia sat at the table, a photo album open in front of her and a half-full mug beside it. Gracia turned around to look at who had entered the kitchen, frowning when Albedo came into view. "Nightmares?" she asked quietly. "I suppose you could call them that," Albedo replied. "Sit," she instructed gently, "I'll pour you some tea." "Thank you," he took the seat across from her as she stood. There was already a recently brewed pot of warm chamomile on the countertop. Gracia only had to pull out a mug and pour some. Albedo sat silently, letting the sounds of Gracia's movement behind him fill his ears. Gracia finally set down the cup in front of him, and once again took her seat. They sat in comfortable silence, broken only by occasional sips of tea. Neither of them wanted to be asleep right now, but both wanted to rest. Finally, Gracia spoke. "He's my first love, you know. Mr. Hughes." Albedo looked up from the pattern of light refraction in his tea. She hummed. "You could call him Maze. He was hoping you would." Maze, Albedo tested the name. It felt unusual. "I met him when he was just a general officer." Gracia continued. "So long ago, but I can still remember it clearly," she smiled. "He fell over his own 2 feet when he proposed. Nearly dropped the ring, too." She twisted the ring on her finger, contemplating. "I didn't know if he'd come back from Ishval. It was terrifying." Albedo nodded, taking a sip from his tea. "He came back though, and I thought he was out of danger. He'd take an office position and we'd live together and start a family together." She blinked back tears. "He'll come back, right?" Quote. Albedo shrank into himself, shriveling in guilt. "Sorry." Gracia stretched a cardigan sleeve over her hand and wiped her eyes with it. "I shouldn't ask you that. It's unfair. You can't make Maze wake up sooner or heal him. These things can only happen with time." "I'll try," Albedo started. "I'm trying. I'm starting to study medicine where I can, and I'm going to check records on medical alchemy and learn what I can. I'm doing my utmost." Gracia looked, if anything, sadder. "It's okay, Albedo." Albedo faltered. "It isn't your job or responsibility to heal him. You've already done enough." "Enough." He looked down into his cup. Albedo had made enough of a mess of things. He'd put Maze in enough danger, he'd done enough. "You saved him," Gracia said, and Albedo froze. He looked up tentatively, hopefully, expecting resentment and disappointment and found only affection. "Did you know?" Gracia leaned forward slightly. "The doctor said that if Maze had been treated any later, he would have died. It was only because you were there that he was able to get to the hospital soon enough." Albedo was at a loss for words. "You saved him," Gracia repeated. "Never doubt that. For even a moment." She paused. "He and I owe you more than we could ever repay." "No, Albedo once again faltered. "I should have done more." "You've done more than enough." Gracia reached a hand over the table to rest on Albedo's. "Thank you." Albedo's mouth hung open, but he didn't care to close it. I haven't been forthcoming though, he spoke with his voice lowered, hesitant, scared. I'm not what you think I am. Gracia listened, watching him and waiting for him to continue. I'm a homunculus, he wanted to say. I shook the hand of your husband's would-be killer. I'm not even from this world. I don't deserve your gratitude nor your affection. None of the words left his mouth, and he sat there for a minute, unable to speak. Finally Gracia opened her mouth. It doesn't change that you saved Maze. Nor does it change that you're a good older brother to Nina and Alicia, or that you smile when you're in this home. She sighed. Don't feel forced to tell me anything. You're a good person, and I choose to believe in that. Playing your own villain by trying to turn me against you won't do either of us any favors. Albedo looked down. I'm sorry. Don't apologize, either, Gracia tried. You have no reason to. I have many reasons to, Albedo thought. I'm going to go to Dublith, Albedo said instead. To meet up with Edward and Alphonse. I see, Gracia nodded. I think it'll be good for you to get out of Central for a bit. They'll be good company. Albedo nodded in agreement. Too much had happened in Central recently. He needed a bit of distance to rethink it all. They sat in silence again for a moment. I'm going back to bed, Gracia stood up and turned. Good night, Albedo. Good night, Albedo responded. And, he added as she walked away, thank you. Gracia turned her head back to smile warmly at him. Anytime. When Nina woke up, Brother Albedo was no longer in his bed, though this was something she was a bit too used to by now. The sight of rumpled covers was a relief, since the covers were only neatly made when Albedo hadn't slept in them the night before. Brother Albedo? She called, poking her nose out of the room. I'm in the kitchen, Nina, he called back. Come have some breakfast. Nina brightened and bounded her way to the kitchen, where surely enough, Albedo stood at the stovetop, cooking. You're back. She rushed over to his side, excited. I was back last night, he ruffled her hair with an unoccupied hand. Don't you remember? Quote. Well, yeah, Nina sniffed, vaguely remembering Albedo tossing and turning and speaking in the middle of the night. But I was sleepy. It doesn't count. Albedo chuckled. Go sit, he pointed at the table. Breakfast will be done soon. Nina nodded. Breakfast did indeed finish soon, and Albedo joined her at the table with 2 plates in hand. By now, she'd gotten more used to very carefully holding a spoon in her fist and putting it in her mouth. She showed this off to Albedo, who clapped and smiled, and called her mature and elegant. Nina preened in his attention. She'd missed it a lot. Where's Ms. Gracia? She eventually wondered. Colonel Mustang had to talk to her about something. He looked towards the window. They're just outside, I believe. Oh. Nina, how would you like to go to Dublith with me? Quote. Can I? She practically jumped onto the table. We've been here for so long. Of course, Albedo cleared away the plates. We'll see Edward and Alphonse there, too. Maybe we can even visit Winry on the way if she's still with the brothers. Nina grinned. I want to go. Quote. Alright, Albedo smiled. I'll get the tickets and call the brothers then. We can leave tonight. Gracia, I'm telling you this for your own safety, Mustang tried. Gracia crossed her arms. That isn't going to change my mind. I know the risks. I'd trust him. I'm not saying you have to stop, Mustang pinched his nose ridge. I'm just asking that you exercise caution. Albedo cried Prince, for all intents and purposes, does not exist. He just appeared not too long ago, and there's nothing at all, pertaining to his past. Do you have any idea how suspicious that is? Quote. Yes, Gracia replied coldly. I'm aware. And it's been both mine and Maze's choice to welcome him, and I am going to continue honoring that. Hughes has always been too nice, Mustang rolled his eyes. We're not throwing caution to the wind when we trust, Roy, Gracia folded her hands in her lap. Maze always said, he wants to help. He wants to do good, after Ishval. Mustang stiffened in his seat. You understand, don't you? Gracia's eyes narrowed. It's not just him being lovably reckless. It's his atonement, and my duty as his wife to support it. It's our strength as a couple, as a family. We choose to trust. Mustang grit his teeth. Are you certain? About this? Quote. Absolutely, Gracia nodded without hesitation. He saved Maze, you know. Maze would have died if Albedo wasn't there. I see, Mustang replied. Then I won't take up more of your time. Take care, Gracia. Gracia nodded as she opened the car door. Good day, Roy. The car door closed loudly behind her, and Roy rested his head in one hand, leaning on the side of the car. She's a very wise woman, Hawkeye commented. A good match for Hughes. I see why he always gushes about her. I suppose so, Mustang sighed. I don't like this though. Everything about Chalk Dust is looking fishier and fishier. First, the arrest and the odd exchange between Kreidprinz and the officer. Then, his quick release, even before Mustang was able to make any calls about it, dropping all charges, with the interrogation struck from records. Finally, his empty records. Albedo had gone willingly with the people he'd claimed had attacked Hughes. The acquittal and release reeked of higher-up involvement and corruption. Somehow, Albedo was involved with the group that had nearly killed Hughes. Mustang was going to find out how. 2 train tickets to Dublith for 5:30 p.m., please, Albedo asked the man in the ticket booth. Identification? The man requested, one hand out. Albedo pulled the Silver State Alchemist's pocket watch out of his coat and set it on the counter. The man's eyes widened. Thank you, sir. Your tickets will be ready right away, sir. Albedo pulled out his wallet. How much? Oh, no need, sir, the man enthusiastically waved a hand. Locomotive services are free of charge to state alchemists, since they're often called in for quick repairs on the tracks. Thank you for your services. How convenient. Albedo had not realized that the pocket watch could open so many doors. Tickets obtained, he walked back towards Maze's office building. Sheska? He poked his head into the office. Sure enough, she was at her desk, nearly buried in paperwork. Mr. Kreidprinz. She stood. Are you here for your things? Quote. Yes, Albedo nodded. Sheska pointed to the desk he'd left 2 nights before. It's all there, she said. Nobody's touched it. Though I did add a few more of the transcripts you asked for to the pile. Thank you, Albedo perused his belongings. Indeed, everything was exactly as he'd left it. He gathered them into a pile and pinned them under one arm. I'll be going then. Good luck with your work. You as well, Mr. Kreidprinz, Sheska smiled. And thank you. For giving me something to do with my skill and showing me that it can be helpful to others. I hope you find what you're looking for. Albedo lingered for a moment, nodded, and then left. Sheska laughed a bit internally. Ever awkward, he was. Once again, Albedo found himself at Hughes's bedside. He looked like he was sleeping. He looked as if nothing was out of the ordinary. I'm going to Dublith, Albedo spoke quietly, uncertainly. I'm bringing Nina and meeting the brothers there. Albedo let the silence reply. I wasn't sure about bringing her, at first. I wanted her to stay with Gracia, where she'd be safer. It's been a while, but I don't think she's over her fear of crowds yet. But I think she's also tired of being cooped up in the house by now. Gracia said she missed me, as well. I think Gracia would be angry on Nina's behalf if I left her here. Albedo felt the weight of the stone in his pocket but did not reach for it. He felt a bit nauseous again. I think teacher would be very disappointed in me right now. Repulsed, maybe. She would have left me for this if I were still traveling with her. But it will have been worth it if it keeps you safe, Albedo thought. Good thing she's a whole world away, isn't it? He dryly attempted humor. It didn't seem very funny. I hope you wake up soon, Albedo said. Goodbye for now. Where are you going? Mustang's voice came behind him, almost startling him. Albedo turned around slowly. Something about the colonel put him on edge, but not in the disorienting way the homunculi did. This was more subtle. If you were listening, then you know already. I just got here, chalk dust. So? Quote. Dublith, Albedo replied. To meet up with the Elrics. Mustang nodded, stepping into the room. Don't suppose you could tell me anything about what happened to Hughes before you go? Quote. Ah, Albedo thought. Mustang's words were sharp and clippy, pointed. They hid a slight amount of suspicion and hostility in them. Unfortunately not, Albedo sighed. And if I, as your direct commanding officer, order you to? Quote. I still cannot, Albedo returned. I see. Albedo decided to leave before Mustang could pry anymore. Otherwise, his agreement with the homunculi would be null, and shaking hands with that menace would have been for nothing. Going so soon? Mustang asked behind him. I have no more business, Albedo replied. Have a good day, Colonel. Mustang clasped his hands behind his back. Albedo's footsteps halted, but Mustang wasn't facing him to see. Also, Albedo started, please take care of Hughes. Thank you, sir. Mustang waited stiffly until Albedo's footsteps faded outside of his hearing range. Where did you pick this one up, Hughes? He asked his sleeping friend, sighing. Now I can't tell what to think about him. No records. Talented alchemist. The panicked voice on the telephone overlapped with Albedo's short, formal responses. Watch over him, indeed. The train departed close to sunset, and the hills outside Central looked a brilliant red next to the bright orange and pink sky. Nina sat next to him, quietly humming the tune he'd sang for her on their last train ride. Albedo tapped the back of a pencil to his lips and considered. The long train ride was perfect for uninterrupted activity, but Albedo wasn't inclined to draw right now, and the heavy medical codex in his bag did not seem any more enticing. He closed his eyes. Red. The sunset illuminated his eyelids bright red, the color of the heart in his chest, the color of the stone in his pocket. The color of Hughes's blood. Albedo opened his eyes. Tim Marco had encrypted his knowledge of the Philosopher's Stone with cookbooks. It was a creative idea and had succeeded in hiding powerful knowledge within plain sight. A cipher. Albedo took out an empty notebook and began writing.
Unfortunately, this part is over. I hope you enjoyed it. Apologies for all those quotes. Please have a good morning, afternoon, evening or night. See ya next time.